As rumors of the surviving Tsarevich Dmitry spread across Russia, Boris Godunov attempted to prevent both the claimant and his message from crossing the frontier. Troop numbers along the Polish border were increased, roads were watched, and travelers were questioned. Yet the Tsar soon understood that silence was no longer possible. The story had already reached Moscow, and every attempt to suppress it only made the mystery more powerful. Godunov therefore tried to expose the claimant publicly. Witnesses who had known Grigory Otrepyev during his earlier life were brought forward. Monks, craftsmen, and former companions described the same man, a palace servant who had entered a monastery, wandered through Russia and Ukraine, and eventually reinvented himself as the son of Ivan the Terrible. Their testimony was detailed and largely consistent, but facts alone could not destroy the hope that had begun to spread among the population. The official version of Tsarevich Dmitry's death had always contained uncertainty. Conflicting dates, contradictory burial stories, and changing explanations allowed suspicion to survive. The more the government spoke, the more questions appeared. New rumors accused Boris of murdering members of his own family, preparing to abandon Russia, and hiding the truth about Dmitry's fate. Many Russians no longer trusted the officials defending him. Prince Vasily Shuisky was widely regarded as unreliable, while Patriarch Job appeared too closely tied to the throne to serve as an impartial witness. Dmitry's mother, now living as a nun under confinement, remained inaccessible to the public. Few people had seen her for years, and her silence became another source of speculation. Among ordinary Russians, especially those living far from Moscow, loyalty to the old dynasty remained strong. The people remembered that the rulers descended from the ancient princes of Rus had governed for centuries. For them, the possibility that Ivan the Terrible's youngest son had miraculously survived was easier to accept than the rule of a man many still considered an ambitious outsider. Not everyone welcomed the approaching rebellion. Some Russians despised Boris but feared civil war even more. They understood that replacing an unpopular ruler through foreign invasion and mutiny could destroy the state itself. Yet hesitation was enough to weaken the government. Boris did not need every subject to rebel. He only needed them to doubt. His diplomatic efforts produced little success. Envoys were sent into the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, carrying descriptions of Otrepyev's true identity and demanding his arrest. King Sigismund offered reassuring words, claiming that the Polish government was not officially financing the claimant and that anyone violating the peace would be punished. In practice, however, powerful nobles continued to support Otrepyev with money, soldiers, and political protection. Religious missions sent by Patriarch Job also failed. Appeals to Catholic and Uniate authorities were ignored or blocked before reaching their destinations. By August 1604, Otrepyev's army had gathered near the Dnieper. It was not a great royal army in the traditional sense. It was a mixed force of Polish nobles, mercenaries, Cossacks, exiles, fugitives, and adventurers. Its military strength remained limited, but it possessed something Moscow's armies did not: a message capable of entering cities before the soldiers themselves arrived. Everywhere the claimant traveled, proclamations were distributed in his name. They announced that Dmitry Ivanovich had been preserved by divine providence, hidden from his enemies, and now returned to recover the throne of his ancestors. Boris was described as a criminal usurper who had stolen the crown through murder and deception. Otrepyev promised peace, justice, prosperity, and an end to persecution. His supporters declared that all oaths sworn to Godunov were invalid because they had been obtained through lies. Polish magnates reinforced this propaganda with their own statements, presenting the claimant as the genuine heir recognized by trustworthy witnesses. Money was distributed among sympathetic communities, while secret agents entered border towns and spoke directly with soldiers, merchants, priests, and local officials. Government authorities collected and burned the proclamations, but new copies appeared almost immediately. The state could control fortresses and roads, yet it could not prevent rumors from moving from one village to another. Otrepyev's agents adapted their message to whatever the population wished to hear. Some claimed Boris had always known Dmitry was alive. Others said that Tsar had lost his mind from terror. There were even stories that Boris intended to welcome the returning prince voluntarily. The contradictions did not weaken the movement. Instead, they created confusion. and confusion favored the invader. Many nobles decided to wait rather than commit themselves fully to either side. In October 1604, Otrepiev and his Cossack allies crossed into Russian territory. Only then did Moscow begin assembling a major defensive force. Experienced noble commanders were sent toward Bryansk and the southern fortresses, but the government had already surrendered the advantage of initiative. The first important success came without a battle. The town of Moravsk abandoned Boris and opened its gates to the claimant. Its inhabitants arrested their own governor and presented him as a prisoner. Otrepiev responded with calculated mercy. Rather than ordering an execution, he released the official, declaring that the man had served Boris only because he had been deceived. This act was politically brilliant. It suggested that submission would bring forgiveness rather than punishment. Other towns followed. Olgovich accepted him, and soon the ancient city of Chernigov also declared its loyalty. Soldiers and citizens greeted the advancing claimant according to traditional custom, offering bread and salt as symbols of welcome. Their governor was handed over, pardoned, and then allowed to join the new cause. Each peaceful surrender strengthened the legend that the country itself recognized Dmitry as its lawful sovereign. Otrepiev understood how to perform royalty. He appeared before crowds with confidence, spoke directly to ordinary people, and behaved as though his victory had already been determined. His physical presence and certainty made a deep impression. Along the roads, men and women knelt before him and shouted the name Dmitry Ivanovich. His aim was to advance through the southern cities without unnecessary bloodshed, turning Boris's subjects into his own army. During this advance, the claimant sent a remarkable letter directly to the Tsar. It was not written as a plea from a rebel, but as a judgment pronounced by a rightful monarch against a servant who had betrayed him. Otrepiev accused Boris of stealing the state, manipulating Tsar Fyodor, destroying powerful noble families, persecuting churchmen, blinding rivals, poisoning enemies, and arranging the murder at Uglich. The letter retold the supposed assassination attempt in dramatic detail. Boris's agents, it claimed, had been sent to kill the young prince, but a loyal physician had saved him. The government then deceived Fyodor by reporting that Dmitry had died during an epileptic seizure. Boris was also accused of preventing the grieving Tsar from traveling to Uglich and manipulating the church so that the body would not be brought to Moscow. The accusations extended far beyond Dmitry's fate. Otrepiev blamed Boris for secret executions, political terror, suspicious fires, the persecution of the Romanovs and Schwiskys, and the manipulation of public charity during his election to the throne. Even military decisions were presented as evidence of treason. Boris was accused of allowing the Crimean Tatars to approach Moscow and then permitting them to withdraw unharmed. At the conclusion of the letter, however, Otrepiev offered mercy. Boris was invited to surrender the throne peacefully and accept a quiet retirement. His crimes, the claimant declared, could still be forgiven if he returned what he had stolen. Refusal would bring not only political defeat, but divine punishment. For Boris, this was an enemy unlike any he had faced before. Foreign kings could be opposed with armies, fortifications, and diplomacy. Crimean raids could be answered by cavalry and border defenses. Otrepiev represented something far more dangerous. He combined invasion with memory, religion, dynastic loyalty, and public resentment. His soldiers were limited in number, but his identity challenged the moral foundation of Boris's rule. The struggle was therefore no longer simply a military confrontation between two armies. It had become a contest over legitimacy itself. Boris possessed Moscow, the treasury, the bureaucracy, and the established church. Otrepiev possessed the name Dmitry, the promise of restoration, and a population increasingly willing to believe that God had returned the rightful heir to punish a usurper. In that conflict, weapons alone would not decide the future of Russia. As the rebellion expanded across southern Russia, city after city abandoned Boris Godunov and declared loyalty to the man calling himself Dmitry Ivanovich. Putyvl became one of the movement's most important strongholds, and its governor, Prince Vasily Mosalsky, emerged as an active supporter of the claimant. From there, the uprising spread across a vast frontier. towns that had once represented Moscow's authority now arrested Godunov's officials, handed them over to the rebels, and opened their gates without resistance. Otrepiev continued to use mercy as a political weapon. Captured governors were often spared and then encouraged or compelled to enter his service. This policy produced better results than mass punishment. Officials who expected death instead received pardon, while soldiers and townspeople saw that changing sides did not necessarily mean destruction. As more cities surrendered, the claimant's irregular army absorbed deserters, refugees, adventurers, and men seeking revenge against the government. The rebellion also acquired financial resources. Money secretly transported toward Moscow was intercepted and redirected to Otrepiev's foreign supporters, allowing them to recruit additional soldiers. Yet military strength alone could not guarantee success. Otrepiev understood that he also needed to appear as a legitimate Orthodox ruler rather than a foreign-backed Catholic instrument. Although he had privately accepted Catholicism while in Poland, he publicly presented himself as a devoted son of the Russian Orthodox Church. He ordered the famous miraculous icon of the Mother of God to be brought from Kursk and received it with elaborate reverence. The icon was placed in his own tent, where he was seen praying before it each day. Its presence gave the campaign a sacred character and helped weaken accusations that the claimant intended to surrender Russia to Rome. The rapid series of peaceful victories ended outside Novgorod-Seversky. Unlike the cities that had welcomed Otrepiev, this fortress remained firmly loyal to Moscow. Its defense was led by Peter Basmanov, an experienced commander who had no doubt that the invading claimant was an impostor. Basmanov strengthened the walls, organized the garrison, and prepared the inhabitants for a determined resistance. When Otrepiev's army arrived in November 1604, it was met not with bread and salt, but with cannon fire. An envoy approached beneath a flag of negotiation and demanded surrender in the name of the supposed Tsarevich Dmitry. The message promised protection if the city submitted and total destruction if it resisted. Basmanov answered with open contempt, declaring that Russia's sovereign sat in Moscow and that the pretender and his followers deserved execution. Attempts to undermine the defense from within also failed. Agents were sent into the city to persuade the inhabitants to defect, but Basmanov retained control. Otrepiev then ordered assaults against the wooden fortifications. His troops lacked the discipline and equipment required for a successful siege, and every approach was answered by accurate fire from the walls. Cannon shots damaged sections of the defenses, but failed to create a decisive opening. Basmanov eventually requested time before giving a final response, hoping that the delay would allow the main royal army to arrive. Otrepiev interpreted the request as a sign that the city was close to surrender. In reality, Novgorod-Seversky had become the first serious obstacle to his advance. Despite this resistance, the claimant's army continued to grow. By December, thousands of new supporters had entered his camp. The speed with which southern towns had changed allegiance alarmed Moscow and demonstrated that Boris's effort to expose Otrepiev's identity had failed. The crisis could no longer be managed through proclamations and witnesses. It had become a war. Boris considered taking personal command, as he had during earlier military emergencies. His presence at the front might have inspired loyalists and demonstrated confidence. Yet this conflict frightened him more than conventional invasions. Otrepiev was not merely a foreign enemy. He claimed the Russian crown itself and drew strength from the population's doubts about Boris's legitimacy. The Tsar therefore appointed Prince Fyodor Mstislavsky to lead the royal forces. On paper, the balance strongly favored Moscow. Tens of thousands of soldiers gathered near Bryansk, while Otrepiev commanded only a fraction of that number. Yet Boris's army consisted largely of reluctant conscripts. Many had been forced into service by landowners or officials and had little desire to fight for a ruler they distrusted. Reports of towns welcoming Dmitry as the rightful Tsar further weakened their morale. The government also intensified its religious campaign. Churches were ordered to commemorate Tsarevich Dmitry as dead, while priests denounced Otrepiev as a heretic supported by Catholic powers. Congregations were expected to pray for the defeat of the impostor and affirm the official account of the prince's death. The policy achieved little. Many parishioners no longer trusted the clergy, whom they regarded as servants of Boris's government. Fear of punishment ensured outward obedience, but inwardly the population remained divided. To enlarge the army, Boris demanded recruits from noble estates and threatened severe punishment against landowners who failed to respond quickly. Even members of the clergy who were physically capable of military service were ordered to report for duty. Confiscation, imprisonment, flogging, and loss of clerical rank hung over anyone who hesitated. These methods produced soldiers, but they did not produce loyalty. Sweden offered military assistance, partly because its king opposed Sigismund of Poland. Boris rejected the proposal. Foreign troops would add little to Russia's enormous army and might later allow Sweden to claim credit or demand compensation. Confident in Russia's resources, the Tsar chose to rely on his own commanders. The royal forces moved south with the intention of relieving Novgorod-Seversky. Otrepiev and his spies believed the army would be unwilling to fight. In December, the two sides approached one another near the besieged fortress. Otrepiev initially expected large-scale desertions from the royal camp, but only a few men crossed over. Forced to act, he abandoned the expectation of a bloodless triumph and attacked. The battle was confused and violent. While Otrepiev struck the royal army, Basmanov's garrison emerged from the fortress and attacked the rebels from behind. Although Otrepiev later claimed victory, the result was far less decisive than he desired. His troops suffered losses, and the sight of Russian blood weakened the image of a peaceful restoration. The royal forces withdrew to await reinforcements, while Basmanov returned safely behind the walls. The fighting also damaged Otrepiev's foreign support. Many Polish volunteers had joined in expectation of easy rewards and rapid victories, not a prolonged winter campaign. Discouraged by real warfare, some returned home. Even Yuri Mniszek, one of the claimant's most important patrons, temporarily lost confidence and left the camp. Otrepiev withdrew from Novgorod-Seversky and moved towards stronger positions where he could rebuild his forces. Basmanov returned to Moscow as a celebrated hero. Boris rewarded him extravagantly with money, land, precious objects, and elevation to the boyar rank. The public ceremonies briefly strengthened confidence in the government, but they also created resentment among other commanders who believed their own role had been ignored. Boris's habit of favoring particular loyalists continued to divide the very elite on which his survival depended. The royal army grew larger under Princess Mstislavsky and Vasily Shwisky, while new Cossack reinforcements restored Otrepiev's strength. In January 1605, the campaign reached its greatest battle near Dobronichi. At dawn, the claimant launched an attack against a much larger force. His experience among the Cossacks helped him organize the assault, but courage and mobility could not overcome the difference in numbers and firepower. Otrepiev's army was crushed. Thousands of his soldiers were killed, and the survivors fled in disorder. For Moscow, the news appeared to mark the end of the rebellion. Church bells rang, Thanksgiving services were held, commanders received medals, and money was distributed among the victorious troops. Boris celebrated as though the pretenders' destruction had finally been confirmed. Yet the decisive prize escaped. Otrepiev survived the battle and fled on a wounded horse, first towards Sevsk and then to Rilsk. The royal army had won a major victory, but failed to capture the man whose identity held the rebellion together. That failure would prove more important than the battlefield triumph itself. The government's conduct after the battle further damaged its position. Prisoners were hanged, shot, and tortured, while communities accused of supporting the rebellion were subjected to brutal reprisals. Old men, women, and children were not always spared. Instead of terrifying the South into obedience, the violence convinced many inhabitants that surrender to Boris's army meant certain death. Otrepiev initially fell into despair. His forces had collapsed, foreign allies were leaving, and only a small body of loyalists remained. He considered abandoning the campaign and escaping back into Lithuania. His remaining followers refused to permit it. They reminded him that they had sacrificed their homes and families for his cause, and that Boris would show them no mercy if they surrendered. With retreat offering little hope, they persuaded him to continue. The rebellion began rebuilding almost immediately. Cossacks returned, new volunteers arrived, and survivors of government reprisals entered Putyvl seeking revenge. Otrepiev issued fresh proclamations explaining more of his supposed life in hiding and presenting his defeat as only a temporary setback. His agents spread reports that Boris's soldiers had fought reluctantly and that the royal victory had been accidental. This argument found a receptive audience. Many conscripts in the government army had no desire to destroy towns populated by fellow Russians. Desertions increased, while rebellious cities resisted more fiercely because they believed submission would bring execution. When the royal army demanded that Rilsk surrender, its defenders openly declared loyalty to Dmitry and answered with cannon fire. After an unsuccessful winter siege, the exhausted troops withdrew. Boris reacted with fury when he learned that Otrepiev had escaped and was once again gathering supporters. He blamed his commanders for negligence and sent additional forces south with messages of criticism and contempt. His anger further weakened military morale. Soldiers who had endured freezing marches, disease, and combat resented being treated as cowards after risking their lives for the throne. The royal armies then became trapped in slow winter operations. Rather than advancing directly against Putivl, where Otrepiev was rebuilding his movement, they laid siege to Kromy. The fighting produced no rapid result. Dysentery spread through the camps, frostbite disabled soldiers, and many died without proper care. The campaign became a contest of exhaustion rather than decisive maneuver. Boris also attempted more secret methods. Monks who had known Otrepiev during his religious life were sent toward Putivl, officially to identify and expose him. They were arrested, and poison was reportedly discovered hidden among their belongings. Under interrogation, one claimed that the Tsar had promised them wealth in exchange for assassinating the claimant. Whether the confession was genuine or forced, the prisoners were executed, and Otrepiev gained another powerful story with which to portray Boris as a desperate murderer. From Putivl, the claimant sent a second message to Moscow. This time he attacked not only Boris, but also Patriarch Job, accusing the head of the church of abusing spiritual authority in defense of an unlawful ruler. Once again, he offered the Tsar mercy. Boris could abandon the throne, enter a monastery, and live the rest of his life in peace. If he resisted, the responsibility for further bloodshed would be his alone. The offer was designed less to produce surrender than to reinforce Otrepiev's image as the lawful and merciful sovereign. Boris interpreted it as another intolerable challenge. Far from weakening his determination, the letter convinced him that the conflict could end only with the complete destruction of one of the two claimants. By early 1605, the war had reached a strange balance. Boris possessed the larger armies and had won the greatest battle. Otrepiev had lost thousands of men and narrowly escaped destruction. Yet the government's brutality, poor leadership, and declining legitimacy transformed military success into political failure. Every execution created new rebels, every threat produced reluctant soldiers, and every delay allowed the name of Dmitry Ivanovich to spread further. The pretender had survived his greatest defeat. That survival alone was enough to preserve the legend that divine providence protected him. As long as he remained alive, Boris Godunov could not declare victory. By the beginning of 1605, the struggle for Russia had moved far beyond the southern frontier. Patriarch Job ordered special services throughout the country, asking God to protect the realm from Polish and Lithuanian invasion and from the spread of Catholic influence. From Moscow to Siberia, people now knew that an army was advancing under the banner of the supposedly surviving Tsarevich Dmitry. The government continued to insist that the claimant was Grigory Otrepiev, a former monk and palace servant. Prince Vasily Shwisky declared that he had personally seen and buried the real Dmitry at Uglich. Patriarch Job repeated the same account from the churches of Moscow. Yet their testimony no longer carried authority. Many citizens assumed that both men were speaking under pressure from Boris Godunov and would risk execution if they admitted anything else. Behind the ceremonial confidence of the Kremlin, Boris was approaching collapse. His armies remained larger than those of the pretender, but they were slow, divided, and increasingly unwilling to fight. Commanders disappointed him, soldiers deserted, and victories produced no lasting result. Public generosity had once helped him secure loyalty, but charity could no longer repair his reputation. Threats and punishment only deepened resentment. At court, official life continued with its traditional magnificence. The Boyar Duma met, ceremonies were performed, and the Tsar appeared in full dignity. Beneath the surface, however, the political order was disintegrating. Boris trusted almost no one. The boyars concealed their hostility and fear, while he concealed his despair. In private, only his wife saw how deeply the crisis had wounded him. He wept before her, prayed in the palace chapel, and searched unsuccessfully for some sign that his authority could be restored. His physical health had also deteriorated. Years of stress, illness, and an increasingly rich lifestyle had weakened him. On April 13, 1605, while conducting business with members of the Duma after receiving foreign visitors, Boris suddenly became gravely ill. Blood appeared from his mouth, nose, and ears, and he rapidly lost consciousness. Physicians could do nothing. Within hours, the ruler who had dominated Russian politics for decades was dead. His death transformed the conflict. The crown passed to his 16-year-old son, Fyodor Borisovich. The young ruler possessed intelligence, education, and a reputation for kindness. He had been carefully prepared for government and impressed those around him with his knowledge and maturity. Under more peaceful conditions, he might have become an effective monarch. Yet he inherited not merely a throne, but the accumulated hatred directed against his father. The name Godunov had become inseparable from accusations of murder, repression, famine, and usurpation. The young Tsar's personal qualities could not erase the memory of Boris or of his maternal grandfather, the notorious Maluta Skuratov. Many Russians judged the son through the crimes attributed to the previous generation. Moscow nevertheless swore allegiance to Fyodor, his mother Maria, and his sister Ksenia. Patriarch Job, the boyars, officials, soldiers, townspeople, and peasants pledged not to betray the family or support the man calling himself Dmitri. The formal oath appeared impressive, but the loyalty behind it was fragile. Fyodor attempted to strengthen the regime by recalling experienced political figures. Prince Fyodor Mstislavsky and the Shwisky brothers were summoned from the front, while the disgraced Bogdan Belsky was restored to favor and returned to the Duma. For command of the army, the young Tsar relied upon Peter Basmanov, the celebrated defender of Novgorod-Seversky and one of Boris's most rewarded supporters. Basmanov traveled to the army with Metropolitan Isidore to receive a new oath from the troops. At first, the ceremony succeeded. Soldiers acknowledged Fyodor as Tsar, and Moscow received reassuring news that the army remained loyal. Yet within days, Basmanov's position changed dramatically. The reason for his defection remains uncertain. He may have concluded that the Godunov dynasty could no longer survive. He may have seen that the army's morale had collapsed and that the southern population supported Otrepiev. Personal ambition almost certainly played a role. Under a frightened 16-year-old ruler, Basmanov's future was doubtful. Under a victorious claimant who depended upon defecting commanders, he could expect enormous influence. Whatever his motives, Basmanov abandoned Fyodor and transferred his loyalty to Otrepiev. His decision shattered the remaining military strength of the Godunov government. Princes, commanders, and regiments followed his example. Men who had recently sworn loyalty to the young Tsar now proclaimed Dmitry Ivanovich as Russia's rightful sovereign. The collapse spread quickly. Units stationed at Kromy and Novgorod-Seversky changed sides, followed by leading commanders such as Vasily Golitsyn and Mikhail Saltykov. Central Russian towns also began recognizing Otrepiev. For many, the legitimacy of the old dynasty mattered more than the identity of the claimant. They believed, or chose to believe, that loyalty to the descendants of Ivan the Terrible released them from every oath made to the Godunovs. On May 7th, Basmanov formally announced that the claimant was the lawful Tsar. Thousands of soldiers responded with acclamations. The few commanders who remained loyal fled toward Moscow. Some were captured and delivered to Otrepiev. Others, realizing that resistance was hopeless, submitted and offered their services to the advancing ruler. By the middle of May, Otrepiev commanded an army said to number tens of thousands, supported by artillery and by many of the same nobles who had once fought against him. He left Putyvl and began moving toward Moscow. The rebellion had effectively become a royal procession. At every town, crowds greeted him with gifts, prayers, and traditional symbols of welcome. Governors were brought before him in chains, gates were opened, and soldiers declared loyalty. Otrepiev traveled with only a portion of his army, confident that Moscow would fall before he arrived. He sent agents ahead to prepare the capital while he advanced slowly, presenting himself not as a conqueror, but as the returning sovereign of Russia. Inside the Kremlin, Fyodor received increasingly catastrophic news. He was still grieving for his father and was now forced to confront the collapse of the dynasty around him. Loyal commanders described mass defections at the front. Members of the Duma worried less about defending the throne than about their own survival once Otrepiev entered the capital. The young Tsar attempted to reward those who remained faithful, but wealth could not reverse the political tide. The government arrested messengers, burned proclamations, and tried to isolate Moscow from the advancing rebellion. Otrepiev responded by sending trusted agents through Krasnoye Selo, where local residents openly recognized him as Tsar and accompanied the messengers into Moscow. On June 1st, a large crowd gathered in Red Square to hear Otrepiev's proclamation. The message was carefully designed. It did not condemn the people for having accepted Boris. Instead, it portrayed them as victims deceived by a powerful criminal. The claimant declared that he returned without vengeance, that Moscow's oaths to the Godunovs were invalid, and that the city should avoid a destructive civil war. He reminded the boyars of the humiliations they had suffered under Boris and promised to restore their property and dignity. He warned that a great army, including foreign troops, stood behind him. Moscow was invited to send churchmen, nobles, merchants, and officials to recognize him formally as the rightful ruler. The proclamation destroyed what remained of Fyodor's authority. Some listeners may still have doubted Otrepiev's identity, but few believed the Godunovs could now survive. Patriarch Job urged the nobles to resist, yet he was too afraid to appear before the crowd himself. From within the Kremlin, he could only watch the political order he had defended collapse. Several prominent men attempted to arrest the messengers and restore control. The crowd resisted. Voices rose across the square declaring that the age of the Godunovs had ended and that Russia had suffered enough under their rule. Shouts of support for Dmitry turned into demands for the destruction of Boris's family. The mob entered the Kremlin almost without opposition. Guards disappeared, palace servants fled, and the royal residence was overwhelmed. Fyodor was pulled from the throne. His mother begged for his life, while Ksenia remained beside them. The three were removed from the palace and confined under guard in their private apartments. Relatives and supporters of the dynasty were arrested. Their homes were searched, property confiscated, and families sent into exile. Some of the most hated Godunov officials were killed. Foreign merchants associated with Boris also lost their possessions as the new authorities dismantled the political and financial network of the previous reign. Otrepiev remained outside Moscow while his supporters completed the transfer of power. Those nobles who refused to recognize him were expelled from the city and sent to face him. The capital's officials and clergy gradually submitted. Patriarch Job was one of the last major obstacles. He offered to crown the claimant, perhaps hoping to save his position or his life. Otrepiev refused to trust the man who had publicly denounced him and defended Boris. Basmanov and his allies encouraged popular anger against the patriarch. During a service in the Dormition Cathedral, an armed crowd entered, seized Job at the altar, and tore away his vestments. He was dressed as an ordinary monk, dragged from the church, and threatened with death. His execution was prevented, but he was removed from office and sent into monastic confinement. The church that had defended Boris was now forced to adapt to a new ruler. The fate of the Godunov family was decided in secret. On June 10th, armed officials entered the residence where Maria, Fyodor, and Ksenia were being held. The mother and children were separated. Maria was strangled. Fyodor resisted with all the strength of a frightened 16-year-old, but he was overpowered and killed. The public was told that mother and son had taken poison. Their bodies, however, reportedly showed signs of violence. They were displayed before burial, turning the deaths into both a warning and a final humiliation of the fallen dynasty. Reactions were mixed. Some regarded Maria as inseparable from the crimes associated with her father and husband. Others believed she had been punished simply for belonging to the wrong family. The greatest sympathy was directed toward Fyodor. Even those who had hated Boris recognized that the young Tsar had ruled only briefly and had not been given the opportunity to prove himself. Ksenia was spared, though her survival offered little mercy. She was placed under the control of one of Otrepiev's leading supporters and stripped of the protection, position, and family she had once possessed. Even Boris's grave was not left untouched. His body was removed from the Archangel Cathedral, where he had been buried among Russia's rulers. He was placed in a simpler coffin and reburied with Maria and Fyodor in an isolated section of a convent cemetery. The Godunov dynasty had ended within weeks of Boris's death. It did not fall because Otrepiev defeated Russia's armies in a decisive campaign. It fell because the army, the nobility, the church, and the capital no longer believed the dynasty could survive. The claimant's greatest victory was not achieved on a battlefield. It was achieved when thousands of Russians decided that his story, whether true or false, offered them a more useful future than loyalty to the Godunovs. By June 1605, Tula no longer resembled a provincial city. It had become the temporary center of a new regime. Soldiers, nobles, merchants, Cossacks, officials, and visitors from surrounding towns crowded its streets, all waiting to see the man who now appeared certain to become ruler of Russia. Delegations arrived from Moscow carrying the symbols of state authority. The Imperial seal, keys to the treasury, ceremonial clothing, royal armor, and palace servants were presented to Otrepiev as evidence that the capital had accepted him. The same boyars who had hesitated for months now stood before him in submission. He received the Cossacks warmly, recognizing the importance of their loyalty, but treated several senior nobles with visible anger for resisting him until victory had become unavoidable. Otrepiev did not behave like an adventurer surprised by success. He immediately began issuing commands with the confidence of a man who believed he had always been destined to rule. Before learning all the details of the Godunov family's destruction, he sent proclamations throughout Russia announcing that divine protection had saved him from Boris, preserved him through years of exile, and finally restored him to his hereditary throne. Governors were ordered to receive new oaths from the population. Subjects were to swear loyalty to Dmitry Ivanovich and to Marina Nagaya, whom he presented as his mother. They were also warned not to support surviving members of the Godunov family. At the same time, Otrepiev instructed the provinces to remain peaceful, avoid private vengeance, obey the government, and refrain from killing anyone without lawful authority. He wanted to enter Moscow as the restorer of order rather than the leader of a victorious mob. His attention also turned toward foreign affairs. English merchants had enjoyed important privileges under Boris, and Otrepiev had no intention of allowing those relations to disappear. Couriers intercepted diplomatic letters prepared by the previous government and replaced them with messages from the new ruler. He promised additional commercial advantages and proposed sending representatives to England after his coronation to negotiate directly with King James. Once he received confirmation that Moscow had submitted, that Patriarch Job had been removed, and that Fyodor and Maria Godunov were dead, Otrepiev left Tula. He advanced toward the capital and established a camp near Kolomenskoye, just outside Moscow. Officials, nobles, clergy, merchants, and prominent residents came to welcome him. They offered bread and salt, valuable furs, golden vessels, and treasures from the royal collections. In speeches filled with exaggerated devotion, they invited him to enter the city of his supposed ancestors and occupy the chambers of Ivan the Terrible. They declared that the enemies of the rightful dynasty had vanished and that a new age of peace had begun. Otrepiev answered with promises of forgiveness. He claimed that he would not rule through terror, but would become a gentle father to the Russian people. Even foreign communities living around Moscow approached him. German merchants and soldiers explained that their previous loyalty to Boris had arisen from their obligation to the recognized government, not from hostility toward Dmitry. Otrepiev accepted their oath without hesitation. On June 20th, 1605, he entered Moscow in triumph. The procession was designed to display both Russian legitimacy and foreign strength. Musicians, cavalry, infantry, decorated carriages, royal horses, soldiers, clergy, Cossacks, Germans, Lithuanians, and Polish nobles moved through the capital in a long ceremonial column. At its center rode Otrepiev on a white horse, dressed in garments covered with jewels and pearls and surrounded by leading princes and noblemen. The bells of Moscow rang continuously. The streets, rooftops, church towers, walls, and public squares filled with spectators. As he passed, crowds bowed to the ground and greeted him as their father, sovereign, and grand prince. They celebrated his supposed deliverance from death and compared his return to the rising of the sun over Russia. Otrepiev responded loudly, calling them his faithful subjects and asking them to pray for him. Yet, beneath this performance of mutual devotion, he remained cautious. Agents moved through the crowds, listening to conversations and reporting signs of doubt or hostility. He had entered Moscow peacefully, but he did not fully trust the city that had so recently sworn allegiance to the Godunovs. During the procession, a sudden whirlwind threw dust across the road and disrupted the ceremonial order. Many spectators interpreted the event as a warning. In an age when unusual natural phenomena were often understood as divine signs, the cloud of dust appeared to some as an omen of approaching disaster. The first religious ceremony also created unease. Near St. Basil's Cathedral, Otrepiev dismounted and approached the icons carried by Moscow's clergy. Yet foreign musicians continued playing loudly, overwhelming the chanting of the priests. When the procession entered the Kremlin, Polish nobles and other non-Orthodox foreigners followed him into the Dormition Cathedral. To many Russian churchmen, this was a serious violation. Previous Tsars had guarded the sacred character of the Kremlin's principal churches, and the presence of Catholic and Protestant foreigners within the sanctuary immediately raised doubts about the new ruler's faith. His public behavior might appear orthodox, but his foreign connections were impossible to conceal. Otrepiev then entered the Archangel Cathedral and approached the tomb of Ivan the Terrible. Before the gathered crowd, he fell to the ground, wept, and addressed the dead Tsar as his father. He declared that Ivan's prayers had protected him through years of persecution and restored him to the sovereignty that rightfully belonged to him. The performance achieved its purpose. Many of those present began weeping and shouted that he must indeed be the true Dmitri. From the cathedral, he proceeded into the royal palace and sat upon the throne of Moscow. Elsewhere in the city, supporters continued strengthening the illusion of legitimacy. Bogdan Belsky stood before a large crowd in Red Square, raised an icon of St. Nicholas, and swore that the new ruler was genuinely Ivan's surviving son. His testimony carried symbolic weight because of his connection with the former court. The people answered with cries of loyalty and demands that Dmitri's enemies perish. Moscow celebrated late into the night. The new ruler, his nobles, and members of the clergy feasted within the Kremlin, while ordinary residents ate and drank in the squares and their homes. For a brief moment, the city appeared united behind the restored prince. The appearance of unity did not last. Prince Vasily Shuisky had changed his account of Dmitri's death more than once. During the Godunov regime, he had supported the official claim that the prince died in Uglich. After the collapse of the dynasty, he altered his testimony and appeared to accept Otrepiev. Once the new ruler entered Moscow, however, Shuisky privately returned to his original position and began telling others that the man on the throne was an impostor supported by Polish nobles and Catholic clergy. The statements spread quickly and reached Peter Basmanov, who informed Otrepiev. Shuisky and his brothers were arrested. The new government organized a public trial, though its purpose was political rather than judicial. Vasily was accused of betraying the lawful sovereign, undermining public confidence, and conspiring to remove him from the throne. Despite interrogation and torture, Shuisky refused to withdraw his accusation. He continued to insist that the real Dmitri had died in Uglich and that the man ruling Moscow was Grigory Otrepiev. A death sentence followed. On June 25th, Shuisky was led into Red Square and forced to place his head upon the execution block. Soldiers, Cossacks, guards, and armed units surrounded the square, turning the execution into a demonstration of the new Tsar's authority. Before the axe fell, Shuisky declared that he was dying for truth, the Christian faith, and the Russian people. The crowd watched in silence and sorrow. Whatever they thought of his political maneuvering, many Muscovites respected his ancient family and did not want to see him killed. At the final moment, an official rushed from the Kremlin announcing a pardon. Relief swept through the square. The act appeared to confirm Otrepiev's promised mercy and temporarily increased public admiration for him. The decision, however, was not simply an expression of compassion. Marina Nagaya and several influential officials had urged the ruler to spare Shuisky, warning that his execution would damage the new regime's reputation. Otrepiev understood the danger of creating a noble martyr only days after entering Moscow. The Shuisky brothers were therefore spared but not restored to freedom. They were exiled and their property was confiscated. Otrepiev could forgive them publicly while still removing them from the political center. Other former enemies received more generous treatment. Members of the Nagoy family, whom Otrepiev claimed as relatives, recovered their estates, titles, and freedom. Several Romanovs, Sheremetevs, Golitsins, and other noble families persecuted under Boris were restored to prominence. New boyars, chamberlains, treasurers, military officers, and palace officials were appointed in rapid succession. Otrepiev reshaped the court to reward those who had supported his rise. Some traditional Russian positions were reassigned, while new titles inspired by Polish political culture appeared within the government. This helped bind his followers to him, but it also alarmed conservatives who believed that foreign customs were beginning to alter the Muscovite state. Among those restored was Fyodor Nikitich Romanov, who had been forced into monastic life under Boris and had taken the name Filaret. Otrepiev recalled him from confinement and appointed him Metropolitan of Rostov. Filaret was reunited with members of his family, including his young son Mikhail, whose future would later become central to the recovery of the Russian monarchy. Simeon Bekbulatovich, once briefly presented by Ivan the Terrible as ruler of Russia and later blinded and disgraced, also received a pardon. He was permitted to return to court and regain his honorary title. Other prisoners and exiles from Boris's reign were released or assigned new positions in distant regions. The new ruler even used the dead to strengthen his image. The remains of members of the Nagoy family and other victims of Boris's government were exhumed and reburied with honor beside their ancestors. These ceremonies presented Otrepiev as a sovereign correcting injustice across generations. He then introduced measures intended to win support beyond the nobility. The salaries of soldiers and lower-ranking officials were increased. Debts attributed to the reign of Ivan the Terrible were ordered to be paid from the treasury. Certain taxes, penalties, and judicial fees were reduced or abolished. Judges accused of corruption faced punishment, and bribery was publicly condemned. Otrepiev also announced that he would personally receive petitions from the population twice each week. The gesture created the image of an accessible ruler willing to hear complaints directly rather than hiding behind officials. His policies toward peasants and serfs were more complicated. Many who had fled their estates were ordered to return, but exceptions were granted to those abandoned by their landlords during the famine. People forced into labor on state lands could receive freedom under certain conditions. These decisions were designed to balance the demands of landowners with the widespread resentment created by famine and displacement. The foreign soldiers who had accompanied Otrepiev into Russia soon became another problem. Hoping to reassure Moscow, he attempted to dismiss many Polish nobles and bodyguards, offering each of them payment for their service. The rewards failed to satisfy them. Rather than leave, many remained in the capital and spent their money on drinking, gambling, and extravagant celebrations. Their continued presence weakened the carefully constructed image of a national restoration. Otrepiev had entered Moscow as the supposed heir of Ivan the Terrible, but around him stood the unmistakable evidence of the foreign alliance that had carried him to the throne. The same Polish soldiers and Catholic connections that had made his victory possible would soon become a source of growing suspicion and anger. Once established in Moscow, Dmitry began reshaping the government according to ideas he had absorbed during his years in Poland and Lithuania. He considered the traditional Muscovite court narrow, outdated, and too dependent on a small circle of hereditary nobles. The old Boyar Duma was therefore enlarged and reorganized. Senior churchmen were brought into its sessions, partly to strengthen the new ruler's influence over the clergy and partly to satisfy ambitious prelates who desired a more direct role in government. The council's membership expanded dramatically. Metropolitans, archbishops, bishops, nobles, and state officials were gathered into a body increasingly described in Western terms as a senate. Its members were likewise called senators. Where earlier rulers had governed through a comparatively small advisory circle, Dmitry surrounded himself with dozens of men representing both secular and ecclesiastical authority. He attended their meetings regularly and took an active role in debate. Even hostile observers admitted that he possessed a quick mind, a strong memory, and an unusual ability to express complicated ideas clearly. He enjoyed historical comparisons and frequently described customs he had encountered abroad. Poland and Lithuania appeared repeatedly in his arguments as examples of societies he believed Russia should study. He also expressed admiration for Henry IV of France, whom he regarded as an energetic and politically intelligent monarch. Dmitry presented himself as a ruler committed to mercy. During one discussion, he reportedly declared that a throne could be preserved either through cruelty or through generosity, and that he preferred the second path. He had promised God not to govern by unnecessary bloodshed, he said, and wished to be remembered as a forgiving sovereign rather than another Ivan the Terrible. For a time, the language of mercy enhanced his reputation. Clergymen composed praises describing him as courageous, charitable, and divinely protected. Messages even arrived from the Orthodox East, congratulating him on his supposed deliverance. Church leaders living under Ottoman rule hoped that the new Tsar might eventually direct Russian power toward the defense of Eastern Christianity. Yet before Dmitry could present himself fully as a legitimate monarch, he required a formal coronation. The difficulty lay in the patriarchate. Job had been removed, and Dmitry distrusted much of the Russian clergy. Some churchmen had known Grigory Otrepiev personally during his years at the Chudov monastery. Any one of them might recognize him, expose the deception, or use that knowledge for political advantage. The new ruler therefore selected a patriarch who owed his position entirely to him. Ignatius, a Greek churchman who had lived in several regions before entering Russian service, appeared ideal. He possessed no strong base among the Muscovite clergy and had already demonstrated a willingness to accommodate whichever ruler held power. During Dmitry's advance, Ignatius had quickly offered support. In return, he was elevated to the patriarchal throne and entrusted with preparing the coronation. One more public confirmation remained necessary. The army, the nobility, and the capital had accepted Dmitry, but the testimony of his supposed mother carried unique importance. Marina Nagaya, the real mother of the murdered prince, had spent many years confined as a nun. Until she acknowledged him, doubts could never be completely silenced. Dmitry could not know how she would respond. Cooperation promised restoration, luxury, and revenge against the family that had destroyed her former life. Refusal could bring renewed imprisonment or death. The decision placed her between religious conscience, personal grief, political fear, and the memory of the court from which she had been removed. A delegation of distinguished nobles was sent to her convent, carrying a message from the son who claimed to have returned from death. Marina agreed to meet him and was brought to a village outside Moscow. Their reunion was arranged as a carefully staged public spectacle. A large tent stood beside the road, while courtiers and crowds watched from a distance. Dmitry and Marina entered together, remaining inside long enough to create suspense. Their words could not be clearly heard, but when they emerged, both appeared overwhelmed with emotion. They embraced, wept, and behaved like a mother and son reunited after 13 years of mourning. The effect on the spectators was enormous. Many people wept with them. To those already inclined to believe, the scene appeared to settle the question of Dmitry's identity. Marina was placed in a ceremonial carriage and escorted toward Moscow, while the claimant publicly honored her as his mother. After the spectacle, however, she was not allowed complete freedom. She received comfortable quarters and attendance, but her movements and conversations were closely supervised. Dmitry visited her frequently at first, presenting himself as a devoted son while ensuring that she would not withdraw her recognition. Private meetings with outsiders were restricted, since a single careless statement could destroy the foundation of his legitimacy. The coronation took place in the Dormition Cathedral on July 21, 1605. Patriarch Ignatius placed the crown upon the former monk before representatives of the church, the nobility, the provinces, and the royal court. Grigory Otrepiev was formally proclaimed Dmitry Ivanovich, Tsar and Grand Prince of all Russia. The ceremony followed Muscovite tradition, but signs of foreign influence were impossible to miss. A Jesuit delivered congratulations in Latin and presented messages associated with the papal court. Many Russians present understood neither the language nor the purpose of the intervention, but its appearance within the coronation celebrations caused uneasiness. Dmitry then entered the Archangel Cathedral, honored the graves of previous rulers, and publicly connected himself with the dynasty of Ivan the Terrible. The crown associated with Vladimir Monomakh was placed upon his head, completing the sacred and dynastic image he had pursued since first declaring himself the surviving prince. During the celebrations, he also announced his intention to marry Marina Mniszek. To his Polish supporters, the marriage represented the fulfillment of earlier agreements. To many Russians, however, it threatened to bring foreign influence directly into the royal household. The coronation marked the summit of Dmitry's extraordinary rise, but it also began the rapid erosion of his position. Success made him increasingly careless. The confidence that had once impressed soldiers and nobles hardened into arrogance. He enjoyed intellectual debate, but often mocked boyars whose education he considered inferior. He spoke repeatedly of foreign achievements and told Russian officials that their country needed to learn from the West. Such comments offended men who had accepted him for political reasons but had never surrendered their pride. The enlargement of the Senate had already weakened the exclusiveness of the old aristocracy. Foreign titles and practices now appeared at court, while Polish secretaries were placed close to the ruler. The boyars increasingly felt that they had exchanged Boris Godunov's suspicion for Dmitry's contempt. Peter Basmanov remained the Russian noble closest to the Tsar. His defection had made Dmitry's victory possible, and he expected to become the central figure of the new government. Yet Dmitry did not wish to be controlled by the man who had delivered him the army. He sometimes rejected Basmanov's advice merely to demonstrate independence. Their alliance continued, but resentment developed beneath its surface. Outside the Kremlin, the ruler's behavior also began to disturb the population. Dmitry showed little patience for the complex religious customs that Muscovites expected their Tsar to observe. He did not always bow or cross himself before icons. He sometimes ate without allowing a priest to bless the meal and preferred music from his foreign musicians to the solemn rituals of the Orthodox court. Catholic priests and Jesuits were granted comfortable rooms within the Kremlin and permitted to conduct their own services. However limited their actual influence may have been, their presence appeared to confirm earlier warnings that the new Tsar intended to weaken orthodoxy. His clothing, hairstyle, manner of walking, and personal habits reflected the Polish world in which he had developed his political identity. He ate foods that many Russians regarded as improper, rejected traditional court routines, and ignored customs followed by previous monarchs. These actions may have seemed insignificant to him, but in Muscovite society, the ruler's daily conduct possessed religious and political meaning. Dmitry also disliked the confinement of ceremonial monarchy. He slipped from the palace with only a companion or a few guards and visited craftsmen, apothecaries, artists, and metalworkers. Palace servants sometimes searched the streets to locate him. To Dmitry, such excursions demonstrated curiosity and freedom. To many Russians, they degraded the dignity of the crown. A Tsar was expected to appear rarely, surrounded by ritual and magnificence, not wander through Moscow dressed like an ordinary man. His entertainments were equally unconventional. He enjoyed difficult horses, military exercises, firearms, and physical contests. He reportedly entered displays involving bears and tested weapons personally. These activities strengthened his image as an energetic warrior among some observers, but others regarded them as reckless and inappropriate. Dmitry reacted badly when anyone laughed at his failures. The ruler who spoke publicly of mercy could become violent when embarrassed. Officials who mocked him during games or demonstrations risked personal punishment. His unpredictable anger gradually contradicted the generous image he had created during his advance toward Moscow. At the same time, he surrounded himself with extraordinary luxury. His horses carried richly decorated saddles and bridles. Carriages and winter sledges were covered with silver, velvet, and fur. A new palace rose near the Moscow River after buildings associated with Boris were removed. Foreign fabrics, precious metals, and expensive furnishings filled the royal residence. The throne itself became a symbol of the new court's extravagance. Foreign visitors described gold, pearls, diamonds, silver figures, and the imperial double-headed eagle displayed with theatrical magnificence. Dmitri wanted the court to rival those he had heard about or witnessed abroad, but the expense alarmed both officials and ordinary residents. Large sums disappeared from the treasury through construction, celebrations, rewards, gifts, music, clothing, and foreign retainers. Muscovites feared that taxes would eventually be imposed to replace the money. The generosity that had initially made Dmitri popular began to appear irresponsible. His private conduct further damaged his reputation. Stories spread of affairs with married women and young women brought secretly into the palace. Whether every rumor was true mattered less than the growing image of a ruler without restraint. His enemies found such accusations especially useful because they could present his moral behavior as further evidence that he was neither a legitimate Tsar nor a sincere Orthodox Christian. The treatment of Ksenia Godunova became one of the darkest symbols of his triumph. After the murder of her mother and brother, the former princess had been left entirely defenseless. Dmitri took her into his household as a concubine, turning the daughter of Boris into a living trophy of the defeated dynasty. Before Marina Menishek's expected arrival, Ksenia was removed from court, forced into religious life, and given a new monastic name. Dmitri might still have remained on the throne had suspicions about his identity gradually disappeared. Instead, his behavior revived them. He avoided the Chudov monastery, where too many monks might remember the young Grigory Otrepyev. His refusal to enter the monastery only encouraged further speculation. At first, the doubts remained private. People quietly compared the new Tsar's appearance with memories of the fugitive monk. Soon, former companions, monks, Ukrainians, and Russians who had known Otrepyev began speaking more openly. One monk who had studied with Grigory declared publicly that the ruler was the same man. He disappeared shortly afterward and was believed to have been secretly executed. Even members of Otrepyev's own family reportedly recognized him. Relatives who could identify the Tsar as Grigory became dangerous witnesses. Some were imprisoned, while others were sent far from Moscow. Their removal revealed the contradiction at the heart of Dmitri's rule. The man who claimed that truth had defeated Boris could remain on the throne only by silencing those who knew the truth about him. Public accusations continued. A nobleman and a common citizen openly denounced Dmitri as an impostor and enemy of the faith. They were arrested and executed. On the way to death, they proclaimed that the ruler served evil and warned that Russia would suffer further disasters because of him. Many spectators mocked them, but their courage ensured that their accusations continued to circulate. Repression soon expanded. A careless word questioning the Tsar's identity could lead to arrest, torture, confiscation, exile, or death. The government that had promised forgiveness began reproducing the fear associated with Ivan the Terrible and Boris Godunov. Monks from the Chudov community were scattered to distant monasteries, removing men most capable of recognizing Otrepyev from his earlier life. The policy succeeded in creating silence, but not loyalty. Moscow became quieter because people were afraid to speak, not because they believed. Every disappearance strengthened the suspicion that the throne depended upon deception. Dmitri increasingly distrusted Russian guards and replaced many of them with several hundred German bodyguards. They were well paid, housed by the state, and armed with halberds, spears, axes, and other weapons decorated with the imperial emblem. They accompanied him constantly, forming a foreign barrier between the Tsar and his own subjects. The decision revealed his growing isolation. The ruler who had entered Moscow surrounded by cheering crowds now feared those same streets. He believed that a disciplined foreign guard could protect him from assassination, but his real danger did not come from isolated attackers. It came from the nobles who controlled armies, the clergy he had offended, and the population whose enthusiasm had turned into suspicion. His German guards could defend a doorway or a palace chamber. They could not protect a throne that had begun to lose the faith of Russia. While unease spread through Moscow, the Kremlin continued to glitter with music, gambling, feasts, and elaborate court entertainments. Dmitri wanted his reign to appear joyful, modern, and triumphant. Officials dressed magnificently, foreign musicians performed daily, and the palace seemed caught in a permanent festival. Beyond its walls, however, the mood was increasingly different. Many Muscovites concealed their fear and disappointment behind ceremonial smiles. In public, they celebrated. In private, they mourned the direction in which the country seemed to be moving. The new Tsar's foreign supporters expected him to honor the promises he had made before gaining the throne. In Poland, Papal Nuncio Claudio Rangoni continued to encourage him, hoping that Russia would eventually be brought into communion with Rome. Soon after the coronation, Rangoni's nephew arrived in Moscow carrying the blessing of Pope Paul V. Catholic leaders saw Dmitri's success as a rare opportunity to extend papal influence into the heart of the Orthodox world. Dmitri, however, moved cautiously. He understood that an open attempt to subordinate the Russian Church to Rome could immediately destroy his position. State affairs, internal opposition, and preparations for his marriage demanded his attention. As a result, the religious transformation expected by his Catholic allies remained delayed. Relations with King Sigismund of Poland also began to deteriorate. Before becoming Tsar, Dmitri had approached the Polish ruler as a dependent petitioner. Sigismund had provided recognition, protection, and indirect support, and therefore expected obedience and gratitude. Once seated on the Russian throne, Dmitri no longer wished to be treated as a subordinate. When the Polish king addressed him only as Grand Prince rather than Tsar, Dmitri reacted coldly. He demanded recognition as an equal sovereign. Sigismund, aware of the claimant's uncertain legitimacy, refused to grant him the full dignity he desired. The disagreement revealed how quickly Dmitri's ambitions had outgrown the expectations of the men who had helped create him. At the same time, he prepared to fulfill his most important personal promise: marriage to Marina Mniszek. Throughout his campaign, Dmitri had maintained regular correspondence with Marina's father, Yuri Mniszek, calling him both father and friend. Mniszek had written to Russian nobles and officials urging them to accept the claimant as Ivan the Terrible's legitimate son. Now he expected his daughter to become Tsaritsa and his family to receive the wealth and influence promised during the invasion. Dmitri treated the marriage as a personal decision rather than a matter of state. Previous Russian rulers had usually consulted leading nobles when choosing a bride because the woman selected would enter the ruling dynasty and potentially become mother of the next Tsar. Dmitri informed the Senate only indirectly, concealing the full significance of his negotiations with the Polish court. In the autumn of 1605, a Russian delegation traveled to Krakow to formalize the engagement. Its leader described Dmitri's coronation, his ambitions for war against the Ottoman Empire, and his dreams of liberating Constantinople, Jerusalem, and the Christian holy places. These grand plans appealed to both Polish and church leaders, though they also demonstrated the extraordinary scale of Dmitri's imagination. The engagement ceremony took place in November before King Sigismund, members of the royal family, senior clergy, and leading nobles. Marina appeared in white garments covered with jewels and wore a crown upon her head. Because Dmitri remained in Moscow, his envoy stood in his place and placed a diamond ring upon her finger. The celebration was extraordinarily lavish. Marina received precious stones, gold ornaments, carved vessels, rare fabrics, clocks, pearls, and hundreds of valuable furs. The gifts displayed the wealth of the Russian court and the seriousness of Dmitri's commitment. Yet the Russian envoy appeared uncomfortable with the ceremony's almost royal character. Guests already drank to the health of the Tsar and Tsaritsa, even though the marriage had not yet taken place. The following day, Marina sent Dmitri a ring and a painted portrait. Preparations began for her journey east, but Yuri Mniszek repeatedly delayed their departure. He had spent heavily supporting Dmitri's rise and demanded repayment before committing himself further. He also received disturbing reports from Moscow. Russians were becoming suspicious of the Tsar, nobles questioned his identity, and even Marina Nagaya was rumored to have privately denied that Dmitry was her son. Polish leaders dismissed many of these warnings as hostile gossip spread by supporters of the fallen Godunovs or the Świskis. They had invested too much money, prestige, and political ambition to withdraw easily. Dmitry therefore sent large sums to satisfy Mniszek and King Sigismund, compensating them for their earlier support and encouraging the wedding party to begin its journey. In Moscow, Dmitry became increasingly convinced that his position was secure. Protected by foreign guards and surrounded by outwardly obedient nobles, he reportedly believed predictions that he would reign for decades. He continued organizing feasts, arranging marriages among the aristocracy, and distributing wealth to maintain popularity. One of his most politically significant acts was the restoration of the Świski brothers. Vasily Świski had nearly been executed for declaring Dmitry an impostor, yet after several months in exile, he was pardoned and allowed to return with his property and rank restored. The decision delighted Świski's many supporters and reinforced Dmitry's public reputation for mercy. It was also a serious political error. Vasily Świski returned not as a grateful servant, but as a man whose prestige had increased. He belonged to an ancient princely family, had survived torture and a public death sentence, and was widely admired as a defender of orthodoxy and Russian tradition. His near execution transformed him into a living martyr. Dmitry may have imagined that clemency would create loyalty, but Świski understood that only two possibilities remained. Either he would destroy the Tsar, or the Tsar would eventually destroy him. He outwardly swore obedience and resumed his place at court. Beneath that appearance, he began building connections among nobles, clergy, officials, and citizens already hostile to Dmitry. The ruler's attempt to bind him more closely through marriage arrangements achieved little. Świski's personal ambitions and political instincts were far stronger than any gratitude he might have felt. Public hostility toward foreigners continued to increase. Polish, Lithuanian, and German soldiers appeared in Orthodox churches carrying weapons. Some behaved without respect towards sacred objects, leaning against tombs or standing casually during services. The Cossacks who had followed Dmitry into Moscow also gained a reputation for disorder and arrogance. To many Russians, these incidents confirmed that foreign soldiers believed themselves masters of the capital. Resentment gradually developed into broader xenophobia, directed not only at individuals but at the entire foreign presence surrounding the Tsar. Relations with the Orthodox clergy worsened further. Dmitry openly criticized monks, demanded detailed accounts of monastic wealth, and removed large sums from wealthy religious houses to support the treasury, palace expenses, and military forces. Major monasteries were compelled to surrender thousands of rubles. These confiscations transformed the clergy into one of his most dangerous enemies. Priests continued to pray for the Tsar in public because they were required to do so, but in private many described him as a persecutor of the church and an ally of Catholicism. His tolerance toward Lutheran worship in Moscow's foreign quarter deepened their anger. The crisis of legitimacy became even more absurd when another pretender appeared. A Cossack named Ileka was presented as Peter, an imaginary son of Tsar Fyodor Ivanovich. According to the news story, Boris Godunov had secretly replaced the infant prince with a daughter and hidden the true heir. Thousands of Volga and Terek Cossacks joined this supposed prince and began moving through southeastern Russia. Their march was accompanied by widespread plunder. Dmitry did not immediately suppress them. Instead, he invited the new claimant to Moscow and promised him an honorable reception. Almost no one believed the story of Tsarevich Peter, but Dmitry's willingness to accept another miraculous survivor damaged his own credibility. Some suspected that the two impostures were connected. Others concluded that if one obscure adventurer could become a royal prince, then Dmitry's own identity was no more convincing. Even Peter Basmanov, the commander who had made Dmitry's victory possible, reportedly admitted privately that the Tsar was not Ivan the Terrible's son. Basmanov justified his continued loyalty by arguing that Dmitry had been accepted, crowned, and obeyed as ruler. In his view, political reality mattered more than biological truth. The boyars rejected that logic. Their oath, they argued, had been sworn to the true son of Ivan IV, not to Grigory or Trepiev. If the man on the throne was an impostor, then their allegiance had been obtained through deception and carried no sacred obligation. A conspiracy gradually formed across the upper levels of Russian society. Schwiskys, Romanovs, Mstislavskys, churchmen, officials, soldiers, and citizens became connected through a shared determination to remove Dmitry. Some acted from religious conviction, others from dynastic ambition, and still others from fear of Polish domination. The conspirators believed that the arrival of Marina Mniszek would provide the ideal moment. Her marriage and coronation would bring large numbers of armed Poles into Moscow and openly display the foreign character of the regime. Public resentment could then be transformed into revolt. Rumors were deliberately spread throughout the city. Some claimed that Dmitry planned to convert Russia to Catholicism after the wedding. Others warned of foreign wars, new taxes, and territorial concessions to Poland. True accusations mixed with inventions, but the general purpose was clear: to convince the population that the Tsar threatened both the Orthodox faith and the independence of Russia. Meanwhile, Dmitry continued cultivating grand diplomatic ambitions. He spoke of campaigns against the Ottoman world and imagined himself as leader of a vast Christian war. He attempted to maintain good relations with the Crimean Khan, while also sending gifts and messages to rulers farther south and east. His conduct was often careless, and even symbolic mistakes could create offense. While the conspiracy matured in Moscow, Yuri Mniszek continued demanding money. Dmitry sent further payments in gold, silver, and foreign currency. Only after receiving these sums did the Polish delegation finally begin its journey toward Russia. In April 1606, Marina crossed the frontier, accompanied by her father and a retinue of approximately 2,000 Polish and Lithuanian nobles, servants, guards, and adventurers. She traveled in an elaborate carriage drawn by white horses and was escorted by leading Russian officials. Her procession received ceremonial welcomes at every major town. Priests carried icons, governors offered bread and salt, and communities presented expensive gifts in the hope of gaining the future Tsaritsa's favor. From Smolensk to Vyazma, the journey outwardly resembled the arrival of a beloved royal bride. Marina herself reportedly traveled in anxiety. The magnificence around her could not silence warnings about Moscow's hostility or doubts regarding her future husband. The Polish nobles accompanying her possessed different expectations. Many imagined that Dmitry's reign would restore Polish and Lithuanian influence deep within Russian territory and perhaps reverse centuries of Moscow's expansion. To the Russian people, however, the approaching procession looked less like a wedding party than the entrance of a foreign court. Dmitry believed Marina's arrival would complete his triumph. His enemies understood that it might instead provide the final spark needed to destroy him. By the spring of 1606, the distance between the glittering court and the mood of Moscow had become impossible to ignore. Within the Kremlin, music, dancing, gambling, hunting, and banquets continued almost without pause. Dmitry wanted his reign to appear confident and prosperous, and his officials dressed accordingly, turning each day into another celebration. Yet beyond the palace walls, many people wore festive clothes only because the moment required it. In their homes, fear and resentment were spreading. The arrival of Yuri Mniszek and the Polish wedding party intensified this tension. When Mniszek entered the Kremlin on April 25th, he found the man he had once supported as a fugitive now seated upon the Russian throne, surrounded by bishops, boyars, and officers of state. He kissed Dmitry's hand and spoke with the emotion of a man who believed that his gamble had succeeded beyond expectation. Dmitry listened with visible satisfaction, and the two men dined that evening amid displays of royal wealth that deeply impressed the Polish guests. For several days, the visitors were entertained with banquets, music, dancing, and hunts. Dmitry showed off his physical courage, taking part in dangerous spectacles and presenting himself as a warrior king. To the foreign guests, the court seemed rich, energetic, and secure. To many Russians, however, the festivities confirmed that the state treasury was being spent on foreigners, while suspicion and hardship grew within the capital. The future Tsaritsa remained outside Moscow at first. Marina Mniszek's religious status had already created serious difficulties. Dmitri had earlier advised her to respect Orthodox ceremony and adopt the outward habits expected of a Russian ruler's wife. Catholic advisors objected, arguing that she should not be forced to abandon her faith. A compromise was eventually arranged. Marina would attend Orthodox services and participate publicly in certain rites while continuing Catholic worship in private. This accommodation alarmed conservative churchmen. Russian tradition required the consort of an Orthodox Tsar to belong fully to the Orthodox Church. Metropolitan Hermogen of Kazan and Bishop Joseph of Kolomna openly objected to crowning and marrying Marina without an unquestioned conversion. Their resistance was answered with exile. Other prelates, fearing the consequences of opposition, remained silent. Marina entered Moscow on May 2nd before an enormous crowd. Bells rang, cannon were fired, and military bands played as her carriages moved through the streets. Some spectators greeted her with excitement, others with curiosity, but many watched in sorrow. The sight of a Catholic Polish bride surrounded by foreign attendants appeared to confirm their fear that the Kremlin was becoming the center of a foreign regime. Her arrival also created practical resentment. Polish nobles and their servants received the best residences, sometimes after Muscovite families had been displaced. Many of the visitors carried weapons, which was unusual and intimidating in the capital. Rumors spread that the wedding party had not come simply to celebrate, but to remain, occupy important positions, and prepare the way for Polish influence over Russia. The boyars had additional reasons for concern. They learned of earlier promises involving Russian border territories, particularly Smolensk and the Seversk lands. Dmitri called a special council and declared that he would surrender no Russian territory to any foreign ruler. Yet the nobles no longer trusted his assurances. Too many of his earlier agreements had been concealed from them. Marina was housed in a convent while final preparations continued. She made little effort to adopt the austere routine expected there. Special food was brought to her, and entertainers were reportedly admitted in secret. To the nuns and clergy, such behavior appeared to violate the sacred character of the monastery. Each rumor widened the cultural gap between the future Tsaritsa and the population she was expected to rule. The cost of the visit added to public anger. Vast sums were spent on food, lodging, gifts, jewelry, and payments to Yurim Nishek. The treasury, already weakened by Dmitri's generosity and extravagance, was now being used to support thousands of foreign guests. Muscovites increasingly believed that the wealth accumulated by Russian rulers and taxpayers was being transferred to Poland. A week before the wedding, Marina was moved into the Kremlin. Strict instructions were issued concerning her clothing, diet, and conduct, but these preparations could not disguise the religious controversy surrounding the marriage. On May 9th, 1606, Dmitri and Marina appeared together in the faceted chamber. Before the assembled princes and officials, symbols of royal power were brought forward: the cross, crown, chain, and jeweled garments associated with the Russian monarchy. Marina publicly honored the Orthodox cross and crown, then proceeded with Dmitri toward the Dormition Cathedral as the bells of Moscow rang. Their clothing displayed extraordinary luxury. Both wore Russian-style robes covered with jewels, while Marina's headdress was valued at an enormous sum. The ceremony was meant to transform her from a Polish Catholic noblewoman into the Tsaritsa of Russia before the eyes of the court. Inside the cathedral, she knelt before the most sacred icons of Muscovy. Patriarch Ignatius blessed her, placed the crown upon her head, and invested her with the symbols of queenship. The marriage rite followed. She was anointed and admitted to communion, though many continued to doubt the sincerity and legality of the ceremony. Gold coins were distributed as the royal couple left the cathedral. Outwardly, the occasion had all the splendor of a great dynastic union. Yet for many Russians, the sight of Marina wearing the crown associated with the ancient rulers of Moscow was unbearable. She remained, in their eyes, a foreign Catholic raised above Russian noblewomen and Orthodox tradition. The wedding therefore achieved the opposite of what Dmitri intended. Instead of confirming the stability of his dynasty, it convinced growing numbers of people that the throne had fallen under foreign influence. Polish nobles boasted openly that they had given Russia its ruler. Drunken guests insulted Russians, fought in the streets, broke into homes, and were accused of violence against local women. Every incident, whether exaggerated or true, added fuel to the coming revolt. That same night, while the court celebrated, military officers, guards, nobles, and city leaders met secretly under the leadership of Vasily Shuisky. Their purpose was no longer simply to remove Dmitry. They intended to destroy the foreign military presence surrounding him as well. The conspirators had waited until after the wedding deliberately. They understood that the coronation of Marina would inflame public anger more effectively than any speech. By allowing the ceremony to proceed, they transformed a political conspiracy among nobles into a movement that could claim to defend Russia and orthodoxy. During the following days, revelry continued. Dmitry returned only briefly to government business before arranging more entertainments. Meanwhile, the city prepared for violence. Shops stopped selling gunpowder to foreigners. Weapons disappeared from the markets and were collected by men loyal to the conspirators. Meetings spread through military units and city districts. The government sensed danger. Dmitry's guards arrested and interrogated suspected conspirators, but few revealed useful information. Executions continued against men who called him an impostor or enemy of the church. These punishments did not prevent the uprising. They confirmed the conspirators' warning that anyone who remained silent would eventually be destroyed. Rumors also circulated that Dmitry was preparing a decisive move against the Orthodox establishment. According to hostile reports, he intended to use foreign troops to eliminate leading boyars and guards, arrest bishops, and force the population to accept union with Rome. Whether every detail was accurate or deliberately invented, the story was widely believed because it matched existing fears. The conspirators decided they could wait no longer. During the night of May 16th and 17th, thousands of Russian soldiers entered Moscow quietly or took up positions around the city. The gates were secured so that no one could escape or bring assistance from outside. Units loyal to Shuisky were placed near the Kremlin, while officials carried instructions from house to house. Royal guards inside the fortress agreed not to defend the Tsar. Dmitry remained unaware of the scale of the movement. He spent the evening surrounded by music and companions while conspirators prepared lists of targets and assigned troops to strategic locations. Polish nobles and soldiers, exhausted by days of celebration, slept throughout the city. At dawn on May 17th, the bells began to ring. The first alarm was followed by bells across Moscow. Citizens poured into Red Square carrying spears, axes, knives, swords, firearms, and wooden clubs. Guards, merchants, craftsmen, officials, servants, and members of the urban poor joined the crowd. Boyars appeared on horseback and led the movement toward the Kremlin. At the front rode Vasily Shuisky. He carried a sword in one hand and an Orthodox cross in the other, presenting the uprising not as a struggle for personal power, but as a holy defense of Russia against deception and heresy. Pointing toward the palace, he called upon the crowd to advance against the false ruler. Inside, Dmitry awoke to the bells and shouting. At first, he was told there might be a fire. Looking from the window, however, he saw armed crowds moving toward the palace and understood that the danger was political. He summoned Peter Basmanov, the commander whose defection had placed him on the throne. Basmanov went outside to confront the insurgents and demanded to know their purpose. They answered that they wanted the impostor handed over. Basmanov returned to the palace and delivered the truth plainly. Moscow had risen, the people wanted Dmitry's head, and the regime had collapsed. Dmitry seized a weapon and attempted to face the crowd himself. He shouted that he was not another Boris Godunov, perhaps hoping to remind them of the mercy and promises with which he had entered the capital. Shots were fired and his guards pulled him back inside. Basmanov tried once more to negotiate. He appealed to the nobles, condemning rebellion and warning of the chaos that would follow the destruction of royal authority. Yet he no longer commanded the respect he once possessed. To the conspirators, he was the man who had betrayed Fyodor Godunov and enabled an impostor to seize Russia. Mikhail Tatishchev cut him short. With a curse, he drove a blade into Basmanov's chest. The commander fell dead on the palace steps. The man who had opened the road to Moscow for Dmitry was now the first great casualty of the uprising against him. His death announced that negotiation had ended. The palace was surrounded, the foreign guards were isolated, and the ruler who had entered Moscow less than a year earlier, beneath ringing bells and cries of salvation, now stood trapped inside the Kremlin, as those same bells summoned the city to destroy him. The uprising moved through the Kremlin with astonishing speed. Dmitri's foreign guards were overwhelmed, disarmed, or scattered as armed men searched the palace chamber by chamber. Realizing that resistance had become impossible, the Tsar abandoned his weapon and attempted to escape through the interior rooms. He eventually reached a chamber with no further exit. With the crowd closing behind him, he climbed through a window and jumped. The fall onto the stone courtyard left him gravely injured. His leg was broken, his chest and head were struck, and blood spread beneath his body. A few remaining guards lifted him from the pavement. When he regained consciousness, Dmitri begged them to continue defending him. He promised money, advancement, and every reward the throne could provide. The promises no longer carried meaning. The palace had fallen, Basmanov was dead, and the armed crowd had surrounded him. At that same moment, Marina Nagaya was brought from the monastery where she had been staying. The woman whose public recognition had once been essential to Dmitri's coronation now withdrew it completely. Before the assembled people, she declared that her real son had died in her arms at Uglich. She claimed that fear and threats had forced her to acknowledge the stranger as Dmitri. Other members of the Nagoy family offered similar testimony. They admitted that they had supported the claimant only to protect themselves. Marina reportedly displayed an image of the dead prince and invited the crowd to compare it with the wounded man inside the palace. Whatever doubts remained among the insurgents disappeared. Dmitri was dragged back before his enemies and asked to reveal his true identity. Even then, he refused to surrender the role that had raised him from fugitive monk to Tsar. He continued to insist that he was Dmitri Ivanovich and asked for the opportunity to explain his survival. The crowd had no interest in another story. Two nobles fired upon him at close range, ending his life. The body was immediately attacked with swords, spears, knives, and halberds. It was thrown down near the corpse of Basmanov, joining the fallen ruler with the commander whose betrayal had once opened the road to Moscow. The two bodies were stripped and dragged from the Kremlin into Red Square. Dmitri, who had entered the capital less than a year earlier on a white horse beneath ringing bells, now lay naked before the public as proof that the restored prince had been exposed and destroyed. Accounts differed in their details, but all agreed on the violence of the scene. Some described guards driving blades repeatedly through the body. Others claimed that the corpse was tied to a horse and dragged around the courtyard while people threw stones, dirt, and insults. The destruction of the body became a ritual rejection of his kingship. Marina Mniszek faced the same crowd moments after learning of her husband's death. Confused and only partially dressed, she ran from her rooms and was knocked down by insurgents who did not immediately recognize her. She escaped back into the palace, where attackers killed one of her attendants before boyars intervened and placed her under protection. The revolt had never been directed at Dmitri alone. Russian soldiers had already surrounded the residences occupied by Polish nobles and blocked the major streets. The city gates were closed. Foreign guests awakened to cries demanding the death of the Polish gentry and hurried to arm themselves. Yuri Mniszek, his relatives, and several prominent companions survived because leading boyars escorted them under guard. As they were taken toward the Kremlin, they passed the bodies of their countrymen lying across the streets. Their position had reversed completely. Only days earlier, they had celebrated inside the palace as relatives of the Tsaritsa. Now they depended upon Russian nobles to protect them from the population. Elsewhere, no such protection existed. Dmitri's musicians were killed, Jesuit residences were plundered, and Marina's Catholic confessor was tortured to death. Armed crowds then moved into the districts where Poles, Lithuanians, Germans, and other foreigners had been housed. The killings became indiscriminate. Men were attacked inside homes, in courtyards, and along barricaded streets. Some begged for mercy, offered money, or appealed to the safety of their wives and children. Their possessions could not always save them. Russian attackers viewed them not as individual visitors, but as participants in a foreign occupation and enemies of the Orthodox faith. Priests and monks were reported among those encouraging the violence. Religious slogans transformed looting and revenge into a supposed defense of Christianity. Doors were broken with artillery when inhabitants attempted to barricade themselves inside. Polish soldiers, noblemen, priests, doctors, artisans, and merchants were all caught in the slaughter. Women were assaulted and some were abducted. Russians dressed in Polish clothing were occasionally mistaken for foreigners and killed as well. Once leading conspirators realized that the violence had escaped their control, they rode through the streets ordering it to stop. By then, much of the damage had already been done. Thousands were dead or wounded, although surviving accounts disagree over the exact number. The districts occupied by the foreign delegation were filled with bodies and stripped houses. Plunder continued long after the political purpose of the revolt had been achieved. Villagers entered Moscow after the gates reopened and joined in taking whatever remained. By late morning, the city had begun to quiet. Survivors associated with Dmitry were arrested, while residents returned to their homes to discuss the overthrow as a national and religious victory. Many congratulated one another for having saved Russia from Polish domination and orthodoxy from Catholicism. The bloodshed was interpreted less as a massacre than as an act of liberation. This belief would become one of the foundations of the new government's legitimacy. The death of Dmitry created an immediate political vacuum. Russia could not remain without a sovereign, and Vasily Shuisky moved quickly to control the succession. Prince Fyodor Mstislavsky, the most senior and respected boyar, showed little desire to compete for the crown after serving under several rulers and surviving repeated changes of regime. Other possible candidates lacked either sufficient influence or a lineage acceptable to Moscow. Shuisky possessed both ambition and an ancient princely ancestry. He had organized the uprising, survived Dmitry's attempt to execute him, and now appeared before the population as the man who had destroyed an impostor and defended the church. That evening, he spoke publicly in Red Square and presented himself as the best candidate to restore order. Some argued that a broader assembly representing the country should choose the next monarch, as had occurred when Boris Godunov was elected. Moscow's crowd, however, preferred an immediate decision. On May 19th, leading boyars, churchmen, and residents gathered in Red Square. Shuisky was proclaimed Tsar with little meaningful opposition. His elevation was less a national election than a decision made by the political and military forces controlling the capital. The scene carried extraordinary symbolism. Only months earlier, Shuisky had knelt in the same square with his head upon an execution block. Now the crowd celebrated him as the defender of Russia, while the decomposing body of the man who had sentenced him lay nearby. Shuisky initially suggested that a new patriarch should be chosen before the coronation. Patriarch Ignatius had been compromised by his support for Dmitry, and a proper religious authority was needed to consecrate the next sovereign. The crowd rejected delay. Russia, they argued, required a Tsar more urgently than a patriarch. Metropolitan Isidore of Novgorod was therefore called upon to perform the necessary rites. Shuisky also removed possible rivals. Simeon Bekbulatovich, the blind former prince once elevated ceremonially by Ivan the Terrible, was sent to a distant monastery and forced into monastic life. Vasily Shuisky was crowned on June 1, 1606, in the Dormition Cathedral. The crown of monarch was again placed upon the head of a new ruler, only weeks after Marina Menishek had worn it, and less than a year after Dmitry's own coronation. The speed of the succession troubled many Russians outside Moscow. Provincial communities had not been consulted, and representatives of the broader country had played no part in the decision. For them, Shuisky appeared to be the chosen ruler of Moscow's boyars, rather than the accepted Tsar of all Russia. While ceremonies celebrated the new reign, carts carried the dead beyond the city walls. Mass graves received many of those killed during the uprising. Basmanov's relatives recovered his body and buried him privately near the grave of a child. Dmitry's corpse remained in Red Square for several days as an object of mockery and public curiosity. It was eventually buried outside the city in a cemetery reserved for the poor. Even this burial did not end the fear surrounding him. Unusual weather and stories of apparitions near the grave were interpreted as signs that the dead impostor remained dangerous. His body was exhumed and burned. The ashes were mixed with gunpowder, loaded into a cannon, and fired in the direction of Poland. The act was intended to destroy not merely the corpse, but the political and supernatural memory attached to it. Russia had cast the false prince back toward the foreign lands from which he had come. Świecki now had to prove that he represented more than a successful conspiracy. He came from one of the oldest princely families in Russia and could claim descent from the rulers of Suzdal. Yet noble ancestry alone could not stabilize a state exhausted by famine, rebellion, disputed succession, and foreign intervention. His first public commitments were aimed at restoring confidence in government. Świecki had witnessed how unrestricted autocratic power had enabled secret accusations, arbitrary executions, confiscations, and political terror under Ivan the Terrible, Boris Godunov, and Dmitry. He therefore promised to place limits upon his own authority. No person, he declared, would be executed without judgment by a court of boyars. The property of a convicted criminal would not automatically be taken from innocent family members. Accusers and accused would be brought face to face, preventing secret denunciations from deciding a person's fate. Anyone proven to have offered false testimony would receive the punishment intended for the victim. Świecki publicly kissed the cross and swore to observe these principles. The pledge represented an unusual attempt to bind the monarch to law and to the participation of the Boyar Duma. He hoped to present his rule as a return to justice after years of suspicion and arbitrary violence. The Senate created by Dmitry was dissolved and the traditional Duma was restored. Couriers traveled across the country announcing the death of the impostor and the accession of Vasily Świecki. Subjects were ordered to swear loyalty to the new Tsar and to any future wife or children he might have. Marina Nagaya's name was attached to the proclamation, giving additional weight to the official version of Dmitry's exposure. The government portrayed Świecki as the savior of both Russia and the Orthodox Church. Documents attributed to the dead ruler were distributed as evidence. They described promises to place the Russian Church under papal authority, transfer Western territories to Yuri Menisek, and eliminate boyars and guards who resisted foreign control. Letters from Polish nobles were also presented as proof that foreign supporters had known Dmitry was an impostor, but assisted him for profit and political influence. These documents provided a moral and political justification for the uprising. The slaughter in Moscow was reframed as a desperate act of national defense against an approaching coup, religious betrayal, and foreign occupation. The new government then removed officials associated with Dmitry. Men who had received promotion, wealth, or influence under the previous regime were dismissed, exiled, or stripped of rank. Vasily Mosalsky, Afanasy Vlasiev, Mikhail Saltykov, Bogdan Belsky, and members of the Nogoy family were among those displaced from the center of power. Property was again confiscated despite Świecki's promises of legal restraint. Supporters defended the purge as necessary to remove Dmitry's agents from government. Critics saw it as evidence that the new ruler might repeat the same practices he had condemned. Uncertainty surrounded the throne from its beginning. Only a portion of Moscow had actively supported Świecki's election, while the provinces had been excluded. The deaths of Dmitry and the foreigners had not erased the political divisions of the previous year. Świecki was also nearly 60 and had no established heir. Russia had just witnessed the destruction of one dynasty, the murder of a young Tsar, and the rise of an impostor claiming descent from Ivan the Terrible. The succession remained dangerously uncertain. The new ruler promised law, mercy, and stability. Yet his throne had been created through conspiracy, urban revolt, and massacre. That contradiction would follow him from the first day of his reign. Vasily Świecki understood that the memory of Tsarevich Dmitry remained the most dangerous weapon in Russian politics. As long as people could believe that Ivan the Terrible's youngest son had survived, another claimant might appear and gather an army beneath his name. The new Tsar therefore moved quickly to establish an official and visible proof of the prince's death. On the very day of Świecki's coronation, a delegation of bishops, princes, and members of the Nogoy family was sent to Uglich. Their task was to exhume the child's coffin and bring it to Moscow. When the grave was opened, those present claimed that the body remained recognizable despite the passage of 15 years. Objects placed beside the dead prince by his relatives were also found within the coffin and presented as additional evidence of his identity. The remains arrived in Moscow on June 3rd. Marina Nagaya and Tsar Vasily personally inspected the coffin before it was carried into the Kremlin. Shuisky then lifted it onto his own shoulders and joined the procession toward the Archangel Cathedral. The spectacle contained a bitter contradiction. Years earlier, Shuisky had led the investigation that declared Dmitri's death accidental. He had repeated that conclusion under Boris Godunov, altered his position during the rise of Otrepyev, and then used the prince's murder to justify the overthrow of the impostor. Now he presented himself as the guardian of the truth he had once helped obscure. Marina stood within the cathedral and publicly confessed that the child in the coffin was her real son. She asked forgiveness for acknowledging Otrepyev, explaining that threats and fear had forced her cooperation. Churchmen and officials pardoned her since the government needed her testimony more than it needed to punish her. The remains of Dmitri Ivanovich were placed in the Archangel Cathedral among the rulers of the dynasty. His burial in the sacred center of Muscovite monarchy was intended to close the succession question permanently. The dead prince could now be honored as a martyr, but he could no longer be allowed to return. Patriarch Ignatius, who had crowned Otrepyev and performed his marriage to Marina Mniszek, was removed immediately. His vestments were stripped away, and he was reduced to the status of an ordinary monk under confinement in the Chudov monastery. A delegation was sent to invite the elderly Patriarch Job back to Moscow. Job, weakened by age and blindness, refused to resume office. Instead, he recommended Metropolitan Hermogen of Kazan. Hermogen had opposed Marina Mniszek's coronation without a clear conversion to orthodoxy and had suffered exile for challenging the previous regime. His resistance transformed him into a symbol of ecclesiastical integrity. He was summoned to Moscow, chosen by a church council, and installed as patriarch with Shuisky's support. The appointment signaled a new alliance between the throne and the Orthodox Church. Shuisky needed the clergy to defend his legitimacy, while Hermogen needed the crown to restore the authority weakened under Otrepyev. Both men hoped that unity between church and state could stabilize the country. Shuisky also attempted to rehabilitate the memory of Boris Godunov and his murdered family. The bodies of Boris, his wife Maria, and their son Fyodor were removed from the obscure burial place to which they had been condemned after the fall of the dynasty. Their coffins were carried in a solemn procession to the Trinity Sergius Monastery. Monks bore the remains of Boris, while officials carried the coffins of Maria and Fyodor. Ksenia Godunova followed in an enclosed carriage, mourning the family whose destruction she had survived. Spectators reportedly wept as the procession passed. Many remembered not only the accusations against Boris, but also the years of order and prosperity associated with the beginning of his rule and his earlier administration under Tsar Fyodor Ivanovich. The transfer served several political purposes. It condemned the humiliation imposed upon the Godunovs by Otrepyev, presented Shuisky as a ruler capable of restoring justice, and quietly acknowledged Boris as a legitimate crowned monarch. Shuisky himself lacked descent from the direct Moscow line, and recognition of an elected ruler such as Boris indirectly strengthened the principle upon which his own throne depended. Ksenia remained in religious confinement for the rest of her life, separated from politics and deprived of family or position. A place was reserved for her beside her parents and brother, though she would survive them by many years. Having reconstructed the sacred and dynastic narrative of the recent past, Shuisky turned to defense and diplomacy. Troops were sent toward the Oka and the southern frontier to protect Russia from Crimean raids. Efforts were made to repair relations with neighboring states and to prevent the violence against foreigners in Moscow from expanding into a larger war. The wealth Dmitri had given to Marina Mniszek and her family was confiscated and returned to the treasury. The extravagant court was reduced, and the foreign guards who had surrounded the impostor were dismissed. Polish prisoners were gradually released and escorted from the country. The Mniszek family remained under tighter control. Its members were separated and placed in different Russian towns while negotiations continued with King Sigismund. Shuisky sent Prince Grigory Volkonsky to Poland with proposals for restoring peaceful relations. Sigismund refused the offered settlement. He resented the destruction of the political enterprise in which he had invested and remained unwilling to recognize Shuisky fully. The possibility that another claimant might arise in the future continued to serve Polish interests. Relations with several other powers were more successful. England, Denmark, and Sweden accepted diplomatic contact with the new ruler. The Crimean Khan addressed Świecki as a fellow sovereign, while Nogai leaders considered closer submission to Moscow. Russian envoys also attempted to strengthen relations with Austria, Persia, and the Ottoman Empire. These achievements created the appearance of recovery, but Świecki's authority remained dangerously narrow. He had been selected in Moscow without the full participation of the provinces, and many communities regarded his coronation as the private act of the capital's boyars. The first major challenge emerged from a man who had once served Otrepiev. Prince Grigory Shakovskoy became governor of Putyvl, the same southern stronghold from which the first false Dmitry had rebuilt his campaign. The region still contained former soldiers, fugitives, Cossacks, displaced peasants, and adventurers who had benefited from rebellion and feared the return of central authority. Shakovskoy understood the political mood of the south. He knew that many residents resented Moscow's decision to choose a new Tsar without consulting them. He also understood that the name Dmitry remained more powerful than any living candidate. He therefore announced that the man killed in Moscow had not been Dmitry at all. According to his story, the true Tsar had escaped before the uprising and was now hiding until his supporters could reorganize. The corpse exposed in Red Square belonged to an unidentified foreigner or court servant. To make the danger appear immediate, Shakovskoy warned the people of Putyvl that Świecki intended to punish the entire region for supporting Otrepiev. He compared the coming repression to Ivan the Terrible's destruction of Novgorod. The choice, he argued, was simple: rebel now or wait to be arrested, tortured, and killed. Putyvl rose against Moscow. Nearby towns soon followed, including Chernigov, Starodub, Novgorod-Seversky, Belgorod, Kromy, Livny, and others across the southern frontier. Soldiers, landowners, peasants, Cossacks, criminals, and displaced men joined the rebellion beneath the banner of a Dmitry who had not yet appeared. Those who refused to participate faced brutal punishment. Loyal officials were imprisoned, drowned, hanged, impaled, or thrown from towers. Their property was seized and redistributed. Their families suffered violence and humiliation. The rebellion claimed to defend the rightful Tsar, but it also released local vengeance and social hatred. The rebels repeatedly asked when Dmitry would return. Shakovskoy replied that Russia's sun would rise again from Sandomierz, the Polish region associated with the Mniszek family, and the first impostor's rise. Rumors spread through Moscow and the provinces. A boatman claimed that he had ferried mysterious travelers across the Oka River shortly before the uprising, and that one of them had been addressed as Dmitry. Others reported seeing the escaped ruler disguised as a monk near Tula, Putyvl, or the Polish frontier. In Poland, similar stories circulated. Members of the Mniszek household claimed that Marina's husband had survived and was hiding near Sandomierz or Sambor. Russian exiles and former supporters of Otrepiev were said to have met him secretly. One possible source of the rumors was Mikhail Molchanov, a former associate of Otrepiev and one of the men implicated in the murder of Fyodor Godunov. Molchanov had disappeared after Świecki's accession and possessed several qualities useful to a pretender. He spoke Russian and Polish, understood some Latin, and had experience inside the previous regime. Yet he did not resemble Otrepiev closely, and too many people knew his true identity. Molchanov could encourage rebellion through letters and messengers, but appearing publicly as Dmitry would have exposed the fraud almost immediately. He therefore withdrew from the role, leaving the southern rebels with a powerful name but no visible claimant. The absence of a living Dmitry did not weaken the rumors. In some ways, it strengthened them. The less the rebels saw him, the more freely they could imagine him. Every unexplained traveler, missing official, or mysterious letter became proof that the rightful Tsar remained alive. Muscovites themselves began to question what they had witnessed. Some claimed that the corpse in Red Square had not resembled the ruler. Others suggested that magic or substitution had enabled Dmitry to escape. The reign they had recently condemned was now remembered by some as generous and prosperous, compared with Świecki's uncertain government. Handbills appeared in Moscow announcing that Dmitry would return by the new year. They accused Shuisky of murder and usurpation and promised the restoration of lawful rule. The government attempted to identify the writers and distributors, but failed. Metropolitan Pafnuty was sent south to persuade the rebels to submit. The towns refused even to hear him. Marina Nagaya sent letters confirming both the death of her son at Uglich and the killing of Otrepiev in Moscow. She included an image of the real prince as further evidence. The testimony achieved nothing. Those who had accepted one miraculous survival could accept another. For many, belief in Dmitry had become less a question of identity than a weapon against Shuisky. Shakovskoy continued writing proclamations in Dmitry's name. He possessed the state seal taken during the confusion of the Moscow uprising, allowing his letters to appear official. These documents summoned Russia to unite with the southern rebels and overthrow the usurper. The movement soon acquired a military commander in Ivan Bolotnikov. His earlier life was surrounded by uncertainty, but he possessed energy, charisma, and experience sufficient to organize the growing forces. Whether he truly believed Dmitry was alive mattered little. He understood the mobilizing power of the name. Bolotnikov appealed to soldiers, Cossacks, fugitive peasants, servants, and men dissatisfied with the social order. He promised liberation from Shuisky's rule and advancement under the returning Tsar. Noblemen and provincial commanders also joined him, including men who hoped to control the rebellion for their own political purposes. Shuisky responded by sending forces toward Yelets and Kromy. The First Royal Army numbered several thousand cavalrymen, but when confronted by Bolotnikov's troops, it broke and fled. Prisoners were abused as murderers and traitors. Some were drowned or sent to Putovl for execution, while others were flogged and released to carry news of the rebel victory back to Moscow. Bolotnikov advanced north. Orel, Tula, Kaluga, Vinev, and other towns submitted. Additional commanders joined him, including Istoma Pashkov, Grigory Sumbolov, and Prokopy Lyapunov. Unlike the first Otrepiev campaign, this rebellion included not only desperate volunteers, but also trained soldiers, provincial nobles, and established military forces. Many argued that their previous oath to Shuisky was void because the true Dmitry was alive. Officials who resisted were arrested and sent south in chains. Villages were looted and burned. Churches were robbed despite the movement's claim to defend legitimate and sacred authority. The uprising expanded partly through belief and partly through terror. Towns sometimes joined simply to avoid destruction. Shuisky was alarmed but did not surrender. He possessed considerable personal courage, though his strategy remained uncertain. In the autumn of 1606, he issued proclamations explaining the origins of the rebellion and denouncing the supposed survival of Dmitry as an absurd invention. A larger army was assembled under several senior commanders, including Shuisky's talented young nephew, Mikhail Skopin-Shuisky. Most government commanders achieved little. Some retreated after brief fighting, and others withdrew toward villages near Moscow. Skopin-Shuisky alone demonstrated consistent military ability. The rebels reached the approaches to the capital. After devastating Kolomna, they established positions near Kolomenskoye and sent proclamations into Moscow declaring that Dmitry had returned to power. Residents, clergy, and officials were ordered to abandon Shuisky and swear a new oath. The rebels announced that the war had ended and that an age of mercy had begun. At the same time, they encouraged peasants and servants to attack landowners, seize property, and take revenge upon the wealthy. Promises of rank and riches drew new supporters, but they also frightened noble allies who had never intended to sponsor a social revolution. Shuisky fortified Moscow's entrances and concentrated loyal troops around the capital. Some provincial communities, including parts of Smolensk and Tver, expelled rebel forces and returned to royal authority. The continued absence of Dmitry now created divisions within the rebellion. Noble commanders had joined expecting to serve a legitimate monarch, not to remain under Bolotnikov and an army increasingly dominated by Cossacks, fugitives, and rebellious peasants. Prokopy Lyapunov became one of the first major leaders to defect. Convinced that no Dmitry would appear, He abandoned Bolotnikov and entered Moscow with troops from Ryazan and other towns. Shuisky accepted his apology and rewarded him with a court position. More soldiers followed. Shuisky offered pardons in the hope of dissolving the rebellion without further bloodshed. He even promised Bolotnikov a high office if he submitted. Bolotnikov refused. In early December, Skopin-Shuisky led another attack and defeated the rebels near Moscow. Bolotnikov withdrew southward. So many prisoners were captured that the Moscow prisons could not contain them. Some were incorporated into the Tsar's forces, while others were drowned. For his victory, Skopin-Shuisky was raised to the rank of boyar. Moscow briefly believed that the danger had passed. Bolotnikov attempted to enter Serpukhov, but the population denied him refuge. He therefore retreated to Kaluga, where he fortified the town with earthworks, ramparts, and a deep moat. Within days, thousands of fugitives and volunteers gathered around him. From Kaluga, he appealed desperately to the southern leaders for aid. More than reinforcements, he demanded a living Dmitry. A rebellion founded upon the name of a ruler could not survive indefinitely without producing the ruler himself. Shakhovskoy searched for a suitable claimant. Molchanov was too recognizable. Another candidate accepted money and disappeared into Poland. The Cossack Ileka, previously presented as Tsarevich Peter, was summoned again and welcomed as the supposed son of Tsar Fyodor and nephew of Dmitry. The story was no more credible than the previous inventions, but the rebellion now depended upon a collection of royal ghosts. If no convincing Dmitry could be found, perhaps another miraculous heir might hold the army together. Polish troops began entering the southern conflict, and additional towns abandoned Shuisky. Perm, Vyatka, Nizhny Novgorod, and other regions experienced unrest or divided loyalties. The rebellion had become a national crisis rather than a local uprising. Government armies surrounded Kaluga in December 1606, but rebel forces attacked from behind and disrupted the siege. Shuisky divided his commanders across several fronts while remaining in Moscow to guard against another urban revolt. The winter campaign became slow and destructive. Disease spread, supplies disappeared, and soldiers suffered from hunger. In some units, horses became the only available food. A plague struck parts of the country, adding another layer of fear to a population already exhausted by civil war. Shuisky again turned to the church and to the memory of the dead prince. The elderly former patriarch Job was brought to Moscow in February 1607 and appeared before a congregation in the Dormition Cathedral. Job publicly repented for his conduct under Boris Godunov. He admitted that he had concealed the truth concerning Dmitry's death and had defended Boris despite knowing of his responsibility. He asked forgiveness for violating the duties of the Patriarchate and urged the people never again to accept anyone claiming to be the murdered prince. The audience wept and kissed his hand. Job then returned to monastic isolation, where he died a few months later. His confession produced emotion, but little political effect. Those who opposed Shuisky simply dismissed the statement as another performance forced by the government. Testimony had changed too many times under too many rulers. Truth itself had lost authority. The fighting south of Moscow continued. Thousands of Shuisky's soldiers deserted and joined the rebels. The government ordered all able-bodied men to prepare for war and threatened deserters with death. Monasteries were required to send grain to the capital in preparation for a possible siege. The rebels delayed their advance while awaiting reinforcements and the arrival of Ileka. This pause allowed Shuisky to assemble a far larger force. In May 1607, he personally left Moscow and joined armies commanded by his leading nobles. The combined force was said to number tens of thousands. Bolotnikov, Shakhovskoy, and the supposed Tsarevich Peter concentrated their army around Tula. The two sides finally met near the Vosma River in early June. This time, Shuisky's forces held together. The rebel army was crushed, its advance broken, and the surviving leaders were forced back toward Tula. The victory did not end the time of troubles, but it prevented Bolotnikov from capturing Moscow. For the first time since his coronation, Vasily Shuisky had defeated the rebellion in a major open battle. Yet even as the rebels retreated, the deeper crisis remained unresolved. Russia still lacked a ruler trusted by the entire country, and somewhere beyond the frontier, another man could still be found to assume the name Dmitry Ivanovich. After the defeat of Bolotnikov's forces near the Vozma River, Shuisky's army pressed southward. Mikhail Skopin-Shuisky joined the main force, and loyalist troops recovered towns along the road to Tula. The surviving rebel commanders had gathered behind the city's defenses, and the Tsar hoped to end the uprising by capturing them all in a single siege. The encirclement of Tula began at the end of June 1607. Inside the walls were Bolotnikov, Shakovskoy, the Cossack pretender Ileka, and thousands of men who had fought in the name of a ruler they had never seen. As food diminished and the royal army tightened its grip, the old question returned with increasing urgency. Where was Dmitry? Bolotnikov and Shakovskoy continued to insist that he was alive in Lithuania and would soon arrive with foreign assistance. Their promises could no longer satisfy everyone. Messengers were sent westward with an extraordinary mission. If the real Dmitry could not be found, they were to locate someone capable of becoming him. The search eventually produced another claimant. Later accounts gave him different origins and names, but he was described as a poor wanderer connected with the Polish borderlands, educated enough to speak both Russian and Polish, and familiar with Orthodox scripture and ceremony. He bore little resemblance to Grigory Otrepiev, yet physical resemblance had become less important than political usefulness. A Polish adventurer named Mekovetsky became one of his principal organizers. Having known the first impostor's supporters, he taught the new claimant the details of Otrepiev's life, court, escape stories, and political alliances. The man was trained not merely to imitate Dmitry, but to inherit the entire legend created around him. Polish magnates again recognized the possibilities. King Sigismund did not openly crown the enterprise as an official campaign, but money, soldiers, and protection flowed toward it. The death of one impostor had not destroyed the usefulness of Dmitry's name. It had demonstrated how powerful that name could be when combined with Russian division and Polish military support. In August, two men appeared in Starodub and announced that Tsar Dmitry was nearby with an army. They claimed to have been sent ahead to discover whether the population still loved its lawful sovereign. The response was immediate. Residents demanded to see him and swore that they would sacrifice their lives in his service. One of the messengers then pointed toward his companion and declared that the true Dmitry stood before them. No evidence was demanded. People fell to the ground, embraced his feet, and celebrated the return of the ruler who had supposedly escaped death for a second time. The new pretender's success did not depend upon convincing everyone. Many of those who joined him understood that he was not Otrepiev, and certainly not the son of Ivan the Terrible. They served him because they hated Shuisky, feared punishment, desired land, sought military profit, or preferred rebellion to submission. Ivan Zarutsky, an experienced Cossack commander who had supported the first impostor, publicly recognized the newcomer. He bowed before him and promised the same loyalty he had shown before. His performance gave the claimant credibility among soldiers who valued the testimony of a familiar leader more than any proof of royal birth. Southern towns supplied troops, provisions, and recruits. Putivl, Chernigov, Novgorod-Seversky, and other centers, once associated with Otrepiev's rise, again became bases of resistance. The second, Dmitry began gathering an army composed of Polish cavalry, Cossacks, fugitives, peasants, mercenaries, and political adventurers. News of his appearance reached the royal camp outside Tula. A rebel messenger delivered a proclamation demanding that Shuisky surrender the throne to the returning sovereign. Standing before the Tsar, the envoy called him a murderer and usurper. Shuisky answered by ordering his execution. The appearance of another claimant made the capture of Tula even more urgent. Shuisky expanded the siege, but he lacked enough reliable troops for a quick assault. The city's walls remained strong, and the defenders fought with the desperation of men who expected no mercy. The royal army eventually turned the river itself into a weapon. Engineers blocked and redirected the Upa, forcing water into the city. Streets and storage areas flooded. Disease spread through the overcrowded defenses, sanitation collapsed, and the remaining food was ruined. By October, resistance had become impossible. Tula surrendered, and royal forces entered the city. Bolotnikov, Shakovskoy, Ileka, and other leaders were arrested and carried toward Moscow in chains. Prince Andrei Telyatevsky escaped the harshest punishment, protected in part by his connections with the Shuisky family. The victory was celebrated in Moscow as though Shuisky had conquered a foreign kingdom. Bells rang, public feasts continued for days, and the Tsar was praised as the savior of the capital. The prisoners received different punishments. Ileka, the supposed son of Tsar Fyodor, was publicly hanged. Bolotnikov was blinded and later drowned. Several Cossack commanders and determined rebels were removed to distant towns and secretly killed. Shakovskoy was imprisoned in the north, while many lesser participants were sent to Siberia. Shuisky offered amnesty to ordinary soldiers who submitted. He hoped that leniency would detach them from the second impostor and prevent another army from forming. Yet while Moscow celebrated, much of southern Russia had already transferred its loyalty to the new claimant. The defeat at Tula therefore ended one rebellion, but not the civil war. From the western frontier to the lower Volga, towns remained outside Shuisky's control. The second Dmitry gathered strength and waited for the right moment to move north. During this temporary calm, Shuisky turned toward marriage. Nearly 60 years old and without a secure heir, he married Princess Maria Buinosova of Rostov, a woman he had considered years earlier. The marriage was politically sensible, but hostile chroniclers later claimed that it weakened his attention to government. The aging Tsar appeared increasingly absorbed by domestic life and court luxury. His critics accused him of withdrawing from military affairs just as the New Pretenders campaign was gaining strength. Whether this judgment was fair or not, it reflected the growing belief that Shuisky lacked the energy required to command a divided country. While Moscow celebrated the royal wedding, fighting continued elsewhere. A commander who had accepted the Tsar's pardon was sent to restore order in Kaluga, but the residents rejected him. They declared that Dmitry alone was their ruler and that they expected his arrival. The second impostor advanced toward Bryansk with thousands of Polish soldiers and Ukrainian Cossacks. Another pretender appeared at the same time, claiming to be yet another hidden son of Tsar Fyodor. The new Dmitry had no interest in sharing his invented dynasty and ordered the rival executed. Shuisky sent an army to relieve Bryansk. In December 1607, royal troops crossed the Desna and attacked the besiegers from the rear while the town's defenders struck from the walls. The rebel army withdrew and established winter quarters around Orel. The retreat did not destroy the movement. Throughout the winter, the pretender expanded his following. He granted pardons to criminals, promised freedom to fugitive serfs, distributed estates belonging to loyalists, and offered advancement to anyone willing to join him. Polish reinforcements arrived under powerful commanders. Among them were Alexander Lisowski and Roman Rodziński, men whose ambitions extended far beyond serving a supposed Russian prince. Their troops strengthened the campaign, but also introduced rivalry into the pretender's court. Rodziński soon removed Mekovetsky, the organizer who had helped create the second Dmitry. According to hostile accounts, he strangled him personally and then assumed control over the claimant's military and political affairs. The impostor increasingly became a prisoner of the men who supported him. Polish commanders supplied the cavalry, directed strategy, and expected payment in land and treasure. Russian rebels supplied numbers and local knowledge. The claimant himself provided the sacred name that held these incompatible groups together. In the spring of 1608, the army moved north again. Towns that refused to recognize Dmitry were plundered and burned. Shuisky remained in Moscow and entrusted command to his brother Dmitry Shuisky and Prince Vasily Golitsyn. The two armies met near Bolkov in April. Fighting continued for several days, but the royal army eventually collapsed. Some troops fled, while others joined the pretender. The defeat opened the road towards central Russia and confirmed the second Dmitry as a serious threat. As his army advanced toward Kaluga and Moscow, new recruits arrived daily. Peasants, fugitives, adventurers, Cossacks, and dissatisfied soldiers joined in expectation of freedom or reward. At the same time, noble families and landowners fled toward Moscow, fearing that a rebel victory would cost them their estates, ranks, and lives. The conflict had become both a dynastic struggle and a social war. For the poor, the pretender offered release from obligation and revenge against landlords. For many nobles, Shuisky represented the only protection against the destruction of the established order. The Tsar responded by searching for treason inside his own court. Princes and officials suspected of disloyalty were exiled to remote regions. Others were executed. The ruler who had promised an end to secret accusations and political repression increasingly returned to the methods he had condemned. By the summer of 1608, the second Dmitry established his headquarters at Tushino, a village only a short distance northwest of Moscow. From there, he hoped to frighten the capital into surrender without risking a direct assault against its walls. He sent proclamations calling upon Muscovites to abandon Shuisky. No uprising followed. Roman Rozhinsky urged an immediate attack, but the claimant hesitated. Moscow was the capital he hoped to inherit, and he did not wish to destroy its palaces, churches, treasuries, and administrative center. His army was large but uneven. Polish cavalry and experienced Cossacks formed its strongest elements, while tens of thousands of Russian followers lacked proper weapons, training, or discipline. Moscow contained a powerful garrison protected by walls and artillery. The pretender could surround the city, disrupt its roads, and wait for betrayal, but he could not easily storm it. Tushino therefore developed into a rival capital. The impostor held court, distributed titles, issued orders, granted estates, and received delegations. Russia now possessed two governments, two sets of officials, and two men claiming supreme authority. Shuisky attempted to remove Polish support through diplomacy. Negotiations with King Sigismund produced a treaty in the summer of 1608. Both countries agreed to preserve existing borders, avoid war, and release prisoners. Russia promised to free Marina Mniszek and other Poles still held after the Moscow uprising. In return, Polish and Lithuanian troops were supposed to abandon the second impostor. The agreement was almost immediately violated. Polish commanders at Tushino refused to withdraw, and additional cavalry crossed into Russia. The envoys who negotiated in Moscow also collected information about the city's defenses, arsenals, and political mood. Once the prisoners were released, Shuisky discovered that the treaty had protected his enemies more effectively than it had protected Russia. The Polish forces around Tushino divided into separate commands. Jan Sapieha led thousands of men northward toward the Trinity Sergius Monastery, whose wealth and symbolic importance made it an attractive target. Lisowski marched toward Kolomna and threatened the approaches to Moscow. Royal forces defeated Lisowski near a crossing of the Moscow River and recovered Kolomna. Another army attempted to stop Sapieha but was defeated, allowing him to continue toward the monastery. The second impostor's camp was no longer a unified army. Different commanders pursued their own campaigns, collected tribute, occupied towns, and plundered religious institutions. Dmitry provided a banner beneath which they operated, but he possessed limited control over them. Meanwhile, Marina Mniszek and her father were being escorted toward the Polish frontier under the terms of the treaty. Near Smolensk, troops sent from Tushino attacked the convoy and scattered the Russian guards. An envoy approached Marina with a remarkable message. Her husband had survived the Moscow revolt and was waiting for her at Tushino. Marina knew that the man could not be Grigory Otrepiev. She had lived with the first impostor, attended his court, and seen him closely. The new claimant differed in appearance, behavior, and background. Yet returning to Poland meant abandoning the possibility of becoming Tsaritsa. Recognition of the second Dmitry offered another chance at the Russian throne. Yuri Mniszek, still driven by debt and ambition, encouraged his daughter to accept the deception. The decision required an agreement. Marina demanded that a renewed marriage ceremony be performed by a Catholic priest. The claimant reportedly promised not to claim full marital rights until Moscow had fallen and he had been crowned Tsar. In September 1608, Marina entered the Tushino camp. Before soldiers, nobles, Cossacks, and foreign officers, she performed another carefully staged reunion. She wept, embraced the stranger, and addressed him as the husband she believed murdered in Moscow. The second Dmitry responded with equal emotion. Their display transformed political fraud into public proof. For many supporters, Marina's recognition settled the question. The woman who had shared the Kremlin throne with the first Dmitri now declared that the man at Tushino was the same ruler. Those who still doubted found it safer to remain silent. The imposture had been resurrected again. This time it stood not as a wandering claimant approaching Moscow, but as the center of an armed rival state only a few miles from the Kremlin. As more soldiers deserted Moscow for Tushino, Vasily Shuisky's position became increasingly desperate. He no longer trusted the loyalty of his army, and neither of his brothers possessed the military ability needed to reverse the collapse. His most capable commander was his young nephew, Mikhail Skopin-Shuisky. The Tsar therefore sent Mikhail north with a dangerous mission. He was to negotiate with King Charles IX of Sweden, secure a treaty, and recruit foreign troops for the struggle against the Tushino camp. Shuisky had reached the point where he could no longer rely upon Russian forces alone to defend his throne. Moscow itself had become a city under psychological siege. Its walls remained strong, but confidence in the government had weakened. The clergy prayed publicly for Shuisky and reminded worshippers of his earlier services to Russia, yet sermons could not erase years of civil war, destroyed towns, failed armies, and constant rumors of betrayal. Residents felt trapped between two governments. Rebel horsemen approached the outskirts and helped defectors escape toward Tushino. Families sometimes divided deliberately, sending one relative to the impostors' camp while another remained in Moscow. Whatever side won, they hoped that someone within the victorious camp would protect the rest. Trade continued secretly across the military lines. Smugglers carried food, salt, clothing, and weapons out of Moscow and sold them to the very army surrounding the capital. Few dared report the activity. Informers risked revenge from neighbors and accusations that could become fatal if Shuisky fell. The Tsar understood that collaboration was occurring, but hesitated to answer with mass arrests. He had promised to govern under law and did not wish to repeat the terror of Ivan the Terrible or Boris Godunov. Yet his restraint also appeared as weakness. He remained inside the fortified capital, waiting anxiously for news from Skopin-Shuisky and Sweden. While Tushino pressured Moscow, another rebel army moved against one of the most sacred institutions in Russia. The Trinity Sergius Monastery possessed not only immense wealth, but enormous spiritual importance. Its churches contained precious vessels, icons, jewels, manuscripts, and gifts accumulated over generations. For the rebels, its capture promised money and prestige. If the monastery submitted to the second Dmitri, the victory would suggest that even the spiritual heart of Muscovy had recognized him. The defenders understood the danger. As enemy cavalry approached, monks, soldiers, servants, and peasants prepared the walls. Families from surrounding villages fled into the fortified complex, carrying whatever possessions and food they could save. Some burned their own homes before leaving so that the approaching soldiers would find neither shelter nor plunder. In September 1608, an army led by Jan Sapieha, Alexander Lisavsky, and other commanders appeared before the monastery. Inside, the defense was organized by Prince Grigory Dolgoruki and Alexei Golokvastov. The fortress soon contained not only its religious community, but large numbers of displaced civilians. The besiegers demanded surrender. They warned that the forces of Dmitri were greater than those of Shuisky and promised mercy if the monastery acknowledged the ruler at Tushino. The commanders, clergy, and residents refused. Rebel camps were established around the walls. Trenches were dug, roads were blocked, and artillery was positioned. For weeks, dozens of cannons bombarded the monastery. The stone defenses suffered damage, but not enough to create a decisive breach. The defenders did not remain passive. At night, small groups descended from the walls by ropes, attacked sentries, destroyed equipment, and disappeared before the larger rebel units could respond. These raids became a regular feature of the siege and prevented the attackers from resting securely. The rebels attempted to burn the defenses by piling brushwood near the walls, but fire had little effect upon the stone fortifications. They then dug tunnels beneath the monastery, hoping to enter through underground passages or collapse portions of the walls. When attackers emerged inside the defenses, monks, soldiers, and civilians fought them back and sealed the openings. The struggle became a contest of endurance. Neither side possessed enough strength to force a quick conclusion. Winter transformed the siege into a disaster for everyone. Food became scarce, clean water was difficult to obtain, and overcrowding created disease. Inside the monastery, scurvy spread through the population. Dozens died each day, and the dead were often buried together in large graves. Archimandrite Joasaph sent messengers to Moscow begging for relief. He warned that only a limited supply of food remained and that disease was destroying the defenders more effectively than rebel artillery. Świecki, still waiting for Swedish assistance, could spare only a very small reinforcement. It was far too weak to break the encirclement. The defenders survived the worst of the sickness until warmer weather returned. Thousands had died, but the monastery had not surrendered. In May 1609, Sapieha's army launched another major assault. Women, children, monks, servants, and soldiers fought together from the walls. They threw stones, poured burning liquids, used fire, pitch, plaster, and sulfur, and struck at anyone attempting to climb the defenses. The attack failed. The resistance of the Trinity Sergius Monastery became one of the most powerful symbols of opposition to the Tuscino regime. While cities and nobles changed sides repeatedly, the monastery endured famine, disease, bombardment, and assault without recognizing the impostor. Unable to capture Moscow or the monastery, the second Dmitry expanded his influence through the surrounding provinces. Commanders were sent toward Suzdal, Vladimir, Rostov, and other northern cities with proclamations, threats, and armed detachments. Many communities submitted. Pereyaslavl and Suzdal recognized the Tuscino claimant and then helped force neighboring towns to do the same. Once one city defected, the pressure upon the next increased. Local officials feared isolation, destruction, or revenge from nearby rebels. Rostov became one of the most important captures. Metropolitan Filaret Romanov was there when rebel forces entered the city. He was seized, stripped of his dignity, dressed in rough clothing, and taken barefoot to Tuscino as a prisoner. The impostor welcomed him publicly as a relative and honored victim of earlier persecution. Filaret belonged to one of Russia's most prominent families and possessed enormous ecclesiastical prestige. His presence could provide the Tuscino court with an appearance of legitimacy that no proclamation could achieve. The claimant therefore declared Filaret patriarch. He was given church vestments, attendance, and a place of honor in the rival government. Russia now possessed not only two rulers, but two patriarchs, Hermogen in Moscow and Filaret at Tuscino. Filaret's position was deeply ambiguous. He may have accepted the title from ambition, necessity, fear, or some mixture of all three. Refusal could have meant imprisonment or death, while acceptance offered a path back into political life. Yet he was never completely free. The Tuscino leaders understood that a man of his stature could become dangerous if he openly changed sides. The second Dmitry used Filaret to display devotion to orthodoxy. Unlike the first impostor, whose association with Jesuits had alarmed Russians, the Tuscino claimant carefully presented himself as a protector of the national church. Marina Menishek also adapted her public behavior. Orthodox clergy taught her Russian rites and customs so that she could appear less foreign before the camp. She venerated icons, attended ceremonies, and performed the part expected of an Orthodox tsaritsa, even though her private Catholic identity remained unchanged. An especially valuable icon taken from Rostov was presented to her as a trophy. Such gestures allowed the Tuscino court to disguise plunder beneath religious ceremony. The fall of Rostov encouraged further defections. Uglich, Kostroma, Galik, Vologda, and other northern towns recognized the second Dmitry. These were precisely the regions from which Świecki had hoped to receive soldiers and supplies if Moscow came under direct attack. Some cities welcomed the rebels as allies and greeted them with cries of loyalty. Others resisted and paid heavily. Towns connected symbolically with the Świecki family were treated with particular severity. Settlements were stormed, burned, and plundered, especially when their soldiers had already been drawn away to defend Moscow. Beluzero and Yaroslavl eventually fell under Tuscino influence. The most humiliating loss was Pskov, one of Russia's proudest and strongest cities. A generation earlier, members of the Świecki family had helped defend it against a Polish king. Now it recognized a pretender supported by Polish troops. The conquerors showed little mercy. Officials loyal to Moscow were arrested, tortured, executed, or impaled. Monasteries were robbed, homes were burned, and civilians were killed while soldiers praised the ruler at Tushino. Much of Pskov survived, but the violence demonstrated that submission did not always protect a city from its supposed liberators. By this stage, Świecki's authority had contracted dramatically. Only a limited number of major cities remained firmly loyal, including Kolomna, Nizhny Novgorod, Saratov, Kazan, and many settlements in Siberia. Even elsewhere, loyalty depended less upon belief in Świecki than upon fear of the social and military chaos represented by Tushino. Russia was now divided between two capitals. Moscow possessed the crowned Tsar, the ancient Kremlin, Patriarch Hermogin, and the formal institutions of government. Tushino possessed a resurrected Dmitry, Marina Mniszek, a rival patriarch, Polish commanders, Cossacks, and an expanding network of provincial supporters. Neither side controlled the country. Both issued decrees, appointed officials, collected taxes, distributed estates, and demanded oaths. Families, towns, nobles, and military units moved between them according to fear, opportunity, survival, and ambition. The struggle was no longer simply about whether one man was the real Dmitry. That question had almost ceased to matter. The impostor's name had become the banner under which Russia's political rivalries, foreign interventions, religious fears, and social grievances gathered. Świecki waited for his nephew to return with Swedish soldiers. The Tushino court waited for Moscow to betray its ruler. Between them, the country was being broken apart. By the end of the summer of 1608, Tushino had ceased to resemble a temporary military camp. It had grown into a rival city of nearly 100,000 people, complete with streets, markets, workshops, houses, administrative quarters, and public squares. What had begun as the headquarters of a pretender now functioned as an alternative capital. Its population reflected the chaos of the country. Fugitive criminals lived beside Cossacks, mercenaries, dispossessed peasants, ambitious nobles, wandering adventurers, and merchants who had discovered that civil war offered extraordinary opportunities for profit. Weapons, horses, stolen goods, food, and information were all traded openly. The camp was sustained by the wealth extracted from towns and villages across northern and central Russia. Barrels of wine and mead were emptied daily. Meat, cheese, grain, and fruit arrived in enormous quantities, much of it taken as tribute or plunder. Tatars and men from distant eastern tribes also entered the settlement, drawn by payment, opportunity, or the promise of reward. At the center stood the expanding residence of the second Dmitry. Russian officials, Polish nobles, Cossack commanders, and foreign adventurers crowded his court. From Tushino, orders were issued across an immense territory stretching from the Ukrainian frontier toward the White Sea, the Urals, and the Caspian region. Yet the apparent power of the camp concealed its dependence upon Moscow. The pretender did not want to destroy the capital. He wanted to inherit it intact. His agents inside the city assured him that hunger, fear, and betrayal would eventually force Świecki's government to collapse without a final assault. Marina Mniszek continued to style herself Tsaritsa. Her public behavior suggested submission to the man she presented as her miraculously surviving husband, but privately she understood the fraud completely. The claimant surrounded her with gifts and luxury, while Yuri Mniszek continued to flatter him in expectation of promised lands and enormous payments from the Moscow treasury. The father's behavior disgusted Marina. She watched him bow, kiss the pretender's hands, and speak as though the imposture were real, all for the possibility of receiving Smolensk, the Seversk lands, and vast quantities of gold. Once convinced that he had secured his interests, Yuri left Tushino for Poland early in 1609. During the spring of that year, Świecki's position finally began to improve. Towns that had earlier submitted to Tushino started to reconsider their allegiance. The Tsar sent appeals to Galich, Yaroslavl, Kostroma, Vologda, Ustyug, and other cities, urging them to expel the rebels and return to lawful authority. The result was not immediate peace, but civil war within the cities themselves. Supporters of Moscow fought neighbors who remained loyal to the pretender. Streets became battlefields. Thousands died as local communities divided between rival governments. The violence was merciless. Rebel detachments continued to burn villages and kill entire populations, including women, children, and the elderly. The destruction no longer resembled an invasion by a foreign army. Russians were devastating their own land with a brutality that invited comparison with the darkest memories of the Mongol conquest. Church leaders were frequent victims. Bishops who refused to recognize the Tushino regime were imprisoned, exiled, tortured, or killed. Some died in captivity. Others were dragged publicly to their deaths. The pretender's claim to defend orthodoxy did little to protect clergy who resisted his authority. Moscow remained filled with sedition. Officials feared the revenge of Tushino more than the authority of Shuisky. The government had become isolated from much of the country, and residents blamed the Tsar for his inability to end a war that had consumed town after town. In February 1609, conspirators inside the capital attempted to remove him. Alarm bells summoned the population to Red Square, where several military and court figures brought Patriarch Hermogen and the remaining members of the Boyar Duma before the crowd. The mutineers argued that Shuisky had never been lawfully chosen by a national assembly. They claimed that a small group of supporters had placed him on the throne through coercion and deception, and that his illegitimate accession had caused the civil war. They accused him of ambition, weakness, and incompetence. The appeal failed. Many residents defended the Tsar, and Patriarch Hermogen condemned the proposed overthrow. The majority of the Duma remained loyal, and government troops dispersed the gathering. The leading conspirators escaped to Tushino that night. Those who remained behind were arrested, tortured, and executed publicly. Shuisky had once promised restraint and lawful judgment, but the growing danger pushed his government further toward the violence of earlier reigns. Hunger created another threat. Merchants hoarded grain in anticipation of a complete siege and raised prices sharply. Supplies entering Moscow were diverted into private stores and sold through a black market. Ordinary residents could obtain bread only at enormous cost or through personal connections. Shuisky and Hermogen ordered merchants to open their warehouses and lower prices, but the commands were ignored. The public again blamed the Tsar. To prevent disorder, he released grain from the government reserves. The measure calmed the city temporarily, but the stored supply was limited and intended for a far greater emergency. While Moscow endured hunger and political conspiracy, Mikhail Skopin-Shuisky completed his mission in the north. In February 1609, he concluded an alliance with King Charles IX of Sweden. Sweden agreed to provide cavalry and infantry for the war against Tushino, with Russia responsible for their pay. Shuisky also committed himself not to make a separate peace with Poland or Lithuania. The Swedish force was not enormous, but it offered something Russia urgently needed: disciplined troops capable of attacking the rebels from the rear. In March, Skopin-Shuisky entered Russia accompanied by General Jacob de Lagarde and the Swedish contingent. Russian soldiers joined them near Novgorod, where the army established a base and prepared its advance toward Moscow. Spring mud delayed the march, but in May the Allied army began moving south. Novgorod contributed additional troops, and towns along the route returned to Shuisky's allegiance. In June, Tver was recovered. The young commander's reputation grew quickly. At a time when older generals had repeatedly retreated or changed sides, Skopin-Shuisky appeared disciplined, energetic, and victorious. Many Russians began to see him as the only leader capable of saving the country. The rebels besieging the Trinity Sergius Monastery learned of his advance with alarm. Sapieha's forces had continued to devastate the surrounding region, burning settlements, stealing supplies, and blocking communication between Moscow and the north. News that Tver had abandoned the impostor spread through Tushino. Soldiers began to debate whether they should remain with the pretender or cross over to Skopin-Shuisky. The camp that had once appeared unstoppable now faced the possibility of internal collapse. The second Dmitry ordered forces northward to confront the advancing army. Skopin-Shuisky, meanwhile, received word that towns from Uglich to the distant northern regions had returned to Moscow's side. The first major confrontation occurred near Kalyazin on the Volga in August 1609. Skopin-Shuisky commanded a mixed army of Russians and a reduced Swedish contingent, since many foreign troops had deserted or dispersed during the difficult campaign. Despite facing a larger rebel force, he won a decisive victory after 2 days of fighting. Sapieha withdrew toward the Trinity Sergius Monastery. The defeat exposed the weakness of Tushino. Moscow had not fallen. Provincial towns were defecting. Sheremetev was advancing from the east. Skopin-Shuisky was approaching from the north. The territory controlled by the pretender was shrinking. In desperation, the claimant again attempted to force the capital into submission. A small assault failed. A larger attack under his direct authority was also driven back by loyalist troops. Meanwhile, Peter Sheremetev recovered towns between Kazan, Nizhny Novgorod, and Kostroma and defeated forces associated with Lisavsky. Vladimir, the ancient center of Russian princely power, renewed its oath to Shuisky. Other cities followed. The Tsar now believed that the combined armies of Moscow, Sheremetev, and Skopin-Shuisky could finally destroy the Tushino camp. The collapse of royal authority had also produced a grotesque multiplication of pretenders. Men appeared claiming to be forgotten sons or grandsons of Ivan the Terrible and Tsar Fyodor. One called himself August and claimed descent from Ivan's marriage to Anna Koltovskaya. Others presented themselves as descendants of the murdered Tsarevich Ivan. Volga Cossacks supported some of these claimants, hoping that another royal name might bring plunder and advancement. When the campaigns failed, the same followers often murdered the men they had recently proclaimed. More supposed sons of Tsar Fyodor appeared in the Ukrainian regions. Their names changed, their stories contradicted one another, and most vanished as quickly as they emerged. The dynasty had become a political costume available to anyone bold enough to wear it. By September 1609, food was again reaching Moscow from liberated towns. Skopin-Shuisky's army had expanded significantly, and he waited for further reinforcements before attempting a final move toward Tushino. The immediate objective remained the relief of the Trinity Sergius Monastery. In October, Skopin-Shuisky attacked Sapieha's forces. Sheremetev advanced from the east and positioned his troops between the besiegers and Tushino, threatening to cut off their retreat. Sapieha withdrew toward the monastery, while Skopin-Shuisky established his headquarters at Alexandrovskaya Sloboda, the former residence of Ivan the Terrible. Winter prevented a complete resolution, but the strategic balance had changed. The armies of Skopin-Shuisky, Dmitry Shuisky, and Sheremetev had broken the momentum of the Pretenders' campaign. Russia's weakness, however, attracted another enemy. The Crimean Tatars recognized that the civil war had stripped the southern frontier of protection. They expected the rival Russian factions to destroy one another and leave the country open to invasion. In the summer of 1609, a Crimean army crossed into Russian territory. Instead of conducting a brief raid and returning to the steppe, it advanced slowly northward, burning villages, carrying away prisoners, and forcing some local inhabitants into service. The raiders reached the region of the Oka, threatening towns not far from Moscow. Shuisky attempted to conceal the scale of the danger, but refugees and messengers brought reports of destruction into the capital. The Tsar now faced enemies from Tushino, Poland, Sweden's uncertain alliance, and the Crimean frontier at the same time. A far greater danger was developing in the west. The delay and indecision of the second Dmitry had disappointed many Russian nobles at Tushino. They began to consider a different candidate, Prince Władysław, the young son of King Sigismund III of Poland. Polish magnates saw the opportunity immediately. Russia was divided, exhausted, and unable to resist a determined invasion. The Polish Senate abandoned the recent peace agreement and approved war. Sigismund raised an army but initially hesitated over the direction of his advance. After consultation, he chose Smolensk. He had been told that the city might welcome him as a liberator from both Shuisky and the Tushino impostor. In September 1609, the Polish army reached Smolensk. It included cavalry, German infantry, Lithuanian troops, and thousands of Cossacks. The attackers camped along the Dnieper and demanded the city's surrender. Sigismund presented his invasion as a holy and political rescue. He claimed that Russia was being punished for the crimes of its rulers and that Russian supporters had invited him to free the country from Świecki, the impostor, and Swedish influence. The defenders rejected the message. Smolensk possessed a powerful wall, a determined population, and a capable commander in Mikhail Shine. Although the regular garrison was small, thousands of residents prepared to defend the city. Night assaults failed. Polish troops attempting to scale the walls were driven back. Mines and tunnels produced little success. With the arrival of winter, the siege settled into a prolonged stalemate. The Polish invasion transformed the political situation at Tushino. Many western towns abandoned the impostor and transferred their loyalty to Sigismund. The king's advance alarmed the pretender's camp more deeply than the recovery of Moscow's armies. Envoys from Sigismund arrived at Tushino late in 1609. Publicly, they proposed cooperation against Świecki. In reality, they intended to absorb the camp into the Polish war effort and remove the second Dmitry as an obstacle. The pretender understood the danger. If he joined Sigismund, the Polish king or his son would inherit the victory. Years of rebellion, deception, and bloodshed would end with Dmitry discarded as a temporary instrument. The envoys spoke separately with Russian nobles and officials. They portrayed Sigismund as the ruler capable of ending disorder, protecting orthodoxy, removing both Świecki and the impostor, and restoring peace. Many Tushino officials responded enthusiastically. They had lost confidence in Dmitry, but feared returning to Moscow and facing Świecki's vengeance. A Polish prince offered them protection, position, and a new beginning. Filaret attended some of these discussions, though his freedom of action remained uncertain. He did not openly oppose the negotiations. Silence was safer than challenging armed Polish commanders or ambitious Russian nobles. The possibility of Władysław's election quickly gained support. Men who had betrayed Świecki and then served the impostor were now prepared to betray Tushino in favor of Poland. Their loyalty was directed less toward any sovereign than toward survival and advancement. Sigismund's representatives also approached Moscow. Their proposals included territorial concessions, particularly Smolensk or the Seversk lands. Świecki refused to engage seriously with demands he regarded as humiliating. At Tushino, Roman Roszynski and other commanders accepted the Polish approach but hesitated to abandon the pretender immediately. They feared that his Russian followers would disperse or return to Świecki before the transition to Polish rule could be secured. Dmitry learned of the negotiations and confronted Roszynski. The meeting became violent. The Polish commander insulted and threatened the man he supposedly served. The pretender escaped and turned to Marina, warning her that his own commanders intended to hand him over to Sigismund. On the night of December 29th, 1609, he fled Tushino. Disguised as a peasant and hidden among cargo on a cart, he escaped with only a trusted companion and traveled south toward Kaluga. At dawn, the camp discovered that its ruler had vanished. Panic followed. Some believed he had been murdered and thrown into the river. Soldiers searched the carriages of Polish envoys. Crowds stormed Roszynski's residence and looted it while demanding answers. Tushino's leaders attempted to calm the army by claiming that Dmitry had only withdrawn temporarily. Few believed them. Some soldiers deserted for Moscow, others joined Sigismund, and many simply scattered. Within days, news arrived that the pretender was alive in Kaluga. The city welcomed him with enthusiasm. Memories of Bolotnikov remained strong there, and the population treated Dmitry as the rightful Tsar betrayed by Polish commanders. A new residence and headquarters were prepared for him. Supporters from Tushino began moving south, and the claimant started rebuilding his army. His policy now changed sharply. Having been threatened by Polish nobles, he presented himself as the enemy of foreign domination. His guards were ordered to kill Poles, Germans, and Russians suspected of loyalty to Świecki. Local officials accused of treason were executed with extreme cruelty. Neighboring towns were subjected to similar purges. Dmitry proclaimed that once he entered Moscow, no foreigner would remain in Russia. The same man who had depended upon Polish money and troops now reinvented himself as the defender of Russia against Poland. He sent proclamations back to Tushino promising wealth and punishment for those who had negotiated with Sigismund. His messengers claimed that he possessed enormous hidden treasures and that only he could reward his loyal followers. Marina remained behind in the collapsing camp. The disappearance of the man she publicly recognized as her husband threatened the title upon which her entire future depended. She moved among the soldiers, pleading with them not to abandon Dmitri. Her appeals were less an expression of affection than desperation. Without the pretender, she was no longer Tsaritsa, only the daughter of an indebted Polish noble who had twice attached herself to a failed fraud. Violence erupted between Dmitri's supporters and Rozhinsky's faction. Hundreds were killed. Marina feared that she might become the next target. In February 1610, she fled Tushino at night on horseback, accompanied by only a few servants. Her departure provoked another mutiny. Soldiers accused Rozhinsky of selling the camp to Sigismund and sacrificing their promised rewards for Polish interests. Rozhinsky survived the unrest and warned Sigismund that the support of the Tushino army could not be secured without money, offices, and guarantees. A delegation of Russian nobles and officials then traveled to Sigismund's camp near Smolensk. Among them were men who had served Otrepiev, Szwisky, and the second impostor in rapid succession. Before the Polish king and his senators, they described Russia's suffering and offered the throne not directly to Sigismund, but to his 16-year-old son, Władysław. They argued that the young prince could end the civil war, unite the country, and create lasting peace between Russia and Poland. The proposal also allowed the Russian nobles to imagine that they could control an inexperienced ruler while protecting themselves from Szwisky's revenge. Polish officials accepted the offer in principle and formed a committee to negotiate the details. The Russian envoys urged immediate action against Moscow. Sigismund remained cautious. He demanded broader acceptance from the army, the nobility, the clergy, and the people. He wanted the entire Tushino camp to swear loyalty before committing his son to the Russian throne. Religion remained the greatest obstacle. Russian representatives insisted that Władysław would have to convert to Orthodoxy before becoming Tsar. Sigismund avoided a final promise while continuing to advance his own interests. The envoys understood that a 16-year-old monarch would remain dependent upon his father. Yet, their immediate concern was not Russian independence, but their own survival. They were honored with banquets and public celebrations. Toasts were raised to Tsar Władysław, even though Szwisky still ruled in Moscow, Dmitri still commanded followers in Kaluga, and Sigismund's army remained outside the walls of Smolensk. Russia now faced three competing futures: the weakened Tsar in the Kremlin, the resurrected pretender in Kaluga, and the Polish prince being offered a crown he had never seen. The Russian envoys who had offered the throne to Prince Władysław immediately began writing to military governors and provincial communities around Moscow. Their letters presented Sigismund's intervention not as a foreign conquest, but as an act of generosity. Poland, they claimed, was entering Russia to end the civil war, destroy the rival claimants, and place a young prince upon the throne who could restore stability. The cities were urged to recognize Władysław in advance and swear loyalty to him as the future Tsar. Most of the Russian nobles who remained at Tushino accepted the proposal readily. They had lost confidence in the second Dmitri and feared punishment if Szwisky recovered his authority. A Polish prince offered them a way to escape both dangers. The Polish soldiers and commanders at Tushino were less easily persuaded. They had not spent years campaigning in Russia merely to receive promises. They expected enormous financial rewards, estates in the western provinces, and compensation for the men and horses lost during the war. Sigismund attempted to satisfy them with further promises. He offered lands in Seversk and Ryazan and assured them that both the pretender and Marina Mniszek would be treated generously if they submitted. Money and reinforcements, he said, would soon be sent to Tushino. Together, they would remove Skopin Szwisky, capture Moscow, and depose Vasily Szwisky. The soldiers refused to trust words alone. Until payment appeared before them, they had no intention of surrendering their independence. Sigismund continued the siege of Smolensk and sent neither the expected treasure nor a major army toward Tushino. Some of his commanders were themselves divided. Certain Polish officers still sympathized with the pretender and refused to abandon the campaign against Smolensk. A few nearby towns accepted the Polish proposals, but Mikhail Shane remained unmoved. After months of siege, he still refused to surrender Smolensk. When invited to negotiations, he listened without enthusiasm and returned behind the walls to continue the defense. Events in Kaluga further weakened the remaining Tushino leadership. The second Dmitry rebuilt his army, Marina joined him, and the city celebrated their arrival as though a royal court had been restored. Kaluga's inhabitants imagined that their loyalty would eventually transform their town into the center of a victorious government. They expected offices, wealth, and influence once Dmitry entered Moscow. Supplies that had once flowed toward Tushino now moved south to Kaluga. The abandoned rival capital began to suffer from hunger and cold. Soldiers who had lived amid luxury only months earlier now lacked food, clothing, and shelter. Attempts to plunder neighboring settlements often failed because loyalist detachments and Skopin-Shwisky's patrols blocked the roads. Tushino's inhabitants complained that their fortune had departed with the pretender. Wealth and honor, they said, had moved to Kaluga, leaving behind only poverty and death. Some soldiers tried to loot what remained of the camp before deserting. Roman Roszynski managed to keep them together for a little longer, but the settlement was already collapsing. At the same time, Skopin-Shwisky strengthened his army. Additional Swedish troops arrived from Vyborg and Narva, and plans were made to cut the routes between Smolensk, Tver, and Moscow. The objective was to isolate the Polish forces, break Sapieha's army, and clear the northern roads. The first great result came in January 1610. After 16 months, Sapieha abandoned the siege of the Trinity Sergius Monastery. His men fled through the snow, leaving weapons, supplies, and equipment behind. The defenders poured from the monastery and stripped the deserted camp. They interpreted their survival as an act of divine protection, but they also understood that Skopin-Shwisky's advance had made the siege impossible. The monastery provided food and money to the victorious army. Swedish mercenaries received payment from its treasury, while the surviving monks and soldiers welcomed the young commander as the man who had rescued one of Russia's holiest sites. Sapieha withdrew southwest, uncertain whether to join Sigismund at Smolensk or the pretender at Kaluga. His army had served as a shield protecting Tushino from Skopin-Shwisky. Once it disappeared, the camp stood exposed. Dmitry had already fled, the soldiers were restless, and no commander possessed enough authority to defend the settlement. Skopin-Shwisky advanced, clearing rebel villages along the way. Roszynski recognized that resistance had become impossible and ordered the evacuation of Tushino. The camp was set on fire. Flames consumed the houses, markets, palaces, warehouses, and streets that had formed a second capital for nearly a year and a half. Smoke covered the horizon as the enormous settlement collapsed into ashes. For a time, Tushino had rivaled Moscow in population and political importance. It had possessed its own Tsar, patriarch, court, army, and administration. Now its residents scattered in every direction. Some went to Moscow and begged for forgiveness. Others returned to their native towns and attempted to disappear. The most desperate continued south toward Kaluga, still hoping that Dmitry would one day reward them. Polish nobles and Russian collaborators traveled toward Smolensk or the western frontier. Roszynski attempted to escape toward Volokolamsk, but was overtaken and killed. Within only a few months, Skopin-Shwisky had assembled a mixed Russian and Swedish army, relieved the Trinity Sergius Monastery, and destroyed the Tushino camp. His achievements were unlike anything the government had experienced since the beginning of the Civil War. On March 2, 1610, he entered Moscow in triumph beside General de la Gardie. Crowds filled the streets, officials welcomed the army, and church bells celebrated the liberation of the capital. Skopin-Shwisky had remained loyal to his uncle even when others changed sides repeatedly. He now began organizing a new campaign intended to destroy the pretender at Kaluga and then relieve Smolensk. His popularity, however, immediately created danger. Court officials feared that the young commander's fame might threaten their own positions. Rumors were carried to the Tsar that the army preferred Mikhail, that the population wanted him as ruler, and that a coup might soon replace the elderly Vasily Shwisky with his victorious nephew. Comparisons spread throughout Moscow. Vasily was likened to Saul, while Mikhail was praised as David, the younger hero who had defeated enemies beyond the ability of the reigning king. Fortune tellers also predicted that Russia's next monarch would bear the name Mikhail. The prophecy would later appear meaningful, although not in the way people expected. Shuisky had no surviving son, only a young daughter. His brother Dmitry assumed that he stood closest to the succession and deeply resented the popularity of their nephew. The rivalry poisoned the royal court. Skopin Shuisky attempted to reassure the Tsar and deny any ambition for the throne. His explanations achieved little. Vasily became reluctant to place the army again under his command. The government instead considered giving greater authority to De la Gardie. The Swedish general recognized the tension and privately warned Mikhail that his life might be in danger. Despite the suspicions around him, Skopin Shuisky continued planning a campaign towards Smolensk. In April 1610, Dmitry Shuisky held a banquet in honor of his nephew. During the feast, Mikhail became suddenly ill after drinking from a cup served by Dmitry's wife, Ekaterina. He died soon afterward at only 23 years of age. Moscow immediately suspected poisoning. Many believed that Dmitry Shuisky and his wife had murdered the young commander to protect their position near the throne. Others suspected that Tsar Vasily had at least known of the plot. No proof was produced, but grief quickly hardened into accusation. The people had lost the one commander in whom they still trusted. Skopin Shuisky was buried in the Archangel Cathedral. At his memorial, churchmen praised him as a Russian Achilles, a young warrior destroyed at the height of his victories. His death was a catastrophe for the government. Dmitry Shuisky assumed command of the army, but the soldiers followed him without confidence. The contrast between the dead nephew and the surviving uncle was too obvious. The Swedish troops also demanded their pay. Shuisky's government lacked money and began seizing precious objects from monasteries. Gold and silver vessels were removed and melted down to finance the campaign. The clergy and population condemned the confiscations as sacrilege. Shuisky's government, which had once promised justice and restraint, now appeared increasingly desperate. De la Gardie eventually organized the Swedish contingent for the march towards Smolensk. The Russian army assembled near Mozhaisk and prepared to confront Sigismund's forces. The Polish king did not wish to abandon the siege, so he sent Hetman Stanisław Żółkiewski with a relatively small but experienced army. Russian and Swedish reinforcements joined Dmitry Shuisky, including former Tushino soldiers who had recently changed sides. The armies met near the village of Klushino in June 1610. Although the Russian-Swedish force was larger, its leadership was weak, its units were poorly coordinated, and many of its soldiers lacked loyalty. Żółkiewski's cavalry attacked repeatedly, breaking one formation after another. The Russian army collapsed. Some units fled, while others negotiated with the Poles. Foreign mercenaries abandoned the battlefield or entered separate agreements. The defeat at Klushino destroyed the last major army defending Shuisky's throne. Żółkiewski immediately exploited the victory. He invited Russian commanders and nobles to swear allegiance to Władysław and sent letters throughout the country announcing that Shuisky's forces had been defeated. Cities now faced an impossible choice. They could recognize Shuisky, support the pretender at Kaluga, or accept a Polish prince who had not yet entered Russia. Each decision carried the possibility of punishment if another faction won. Moscow descended into panic. The Tsar attempted to raise another army, but few trusted Dmitry Shuisky after the disaster. Żółkiewski advanced to Mozhaisk, while the second Dmitry took advantage of the confusion and moved his camp from Kaluga toward Kolomenskoye, close to the capital. The population of Moscow rose against Vasily Shuisky. Demonstrators accused him of having been chosen without the consent of the country and blamed him for the war, hunger, foreign invasion, and the death of Skopin Shuisky. A group of court officials, former Tushino supporters, and provincial leaders proposed a complete political settlement. Shuisky would abdicate, the second Dmitry would be captured and executed, the Polish army would be driven out, and a new Tsar would be chosen by a national assembly. Prokopy Liapunov announced the plan before the crowd in Red Square. It received broad support. Patriarch Hermogen was brought from the Chudov monastery and urged the people not to commit treason against their crowned ruler. His warning was ignored. The remaining boyars decided to remove Świecki and create a temporary government under Prince Mstislavski. In July 1610, a formal demand for abdication was delivered to the Tsar. Vasily refused. Soldiers loyal to the Duma entered the palace, arrested him, and removed him together with his wife and daughter. The former ruler was confined under guard in a private residence within the Kremlin. The removal did not restore order. The former Tushino men who had promised to capture Dmitry instead declared their continuing loyalty to him. Moscow realized that it had been deceived. Hermogin again pleaded for Świecki's restoration, but the crowd feared what the deposed ruler might do if returned to power. They had already participated in his overthrow and could not expect mercy. Świecki now found himself imprisoned in the same surroundings where he had once helped organize the murder of the first false Dmitry. The following morning, armed men and clergy arrived to force him into monastic life. Świecki protested, insisting that he had tried to serve the country and refusing to take vows voluntarily. His resistance had no effect. The ceremony was performed against his will, and he was given a monastic name. His wife Maria was also forced to become a nun. The couple was separated. Vasily was taken to the Chudov monastery, while Maria was sent to a convent. Their daughter disappeared from the political record. The former Tsar's brothers, Dmitry and Ivan, were placed under guard. The Boyar Duma announced that Świecki had abdicated voluntarily and that authority had passed into its hands. Few believed the claim, and the new government could not control either the capital or the provinces. The second Dmitry remained near Moscow, and residents continued leaving the city to join him. Fear of an attack increased each day. Prince Fyodor Mstislavski emerged as the leading figure among the boyars. He had no desire to take the throne himself and argued that only Władysław's election could prevent Moscow from falling to the pretender or being destroyed by the Polish army. The proposal received reluctant support. Some churchmen preferred a Russian candidate such as Vasily Golitsyn or the young Mikhail Romanov, son of Filaret. Yet none of these men possessed an army capable of defending the city. Żółkiewski was already close enough to attack. Negotiations therefore began outside Moscow. Russian representatives informed him that they were prepared to recognize Władysław, but only under strict conditions. The prince would have to accept Orthodox baptism, abandon Catholic influence, and marry an Orthodox Russian woman according to the rites of the Eastern Church. Other conditions protected Russian laws, estates, offices, and social traditions. The boyars assumed that a young foreign Tsar would depend upon them and allow the Duma to control the government. Żółkiewski sent the terms to Sigismund, but received no immediate answer. The Russians feared both the Polish army and Dmitry's nearby camp and refused to wait. In August 1610, Żółkiewski accepted the agreement in Władysław's name. Further clauses fixed the border between Russia and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, demanded the withdrawal of foreign troops, required the end of the siege of Smolensk, and called for the capture and execution of the second Dmitry. Both sides swore to observe the treaty. Banquets followed, and the participants congratulated themselves for ending the civil war. Thousands of Muscovites swore loyalty to Władysław. Clergy repeated the oath inside the Dormition Cathedral in the presence of Patriarch Hermogin. The settlement appeared complete, but almost immediately a message arrived from Sigismund ordering Żółkiewski to occupy Moscow in the king's own name rather than that of his son. Sigismund had no intention of accepting all the conditions negotiated by his commander. He was deeply committed to Catholic expansion and hoped to secure direct control over Russia. Żółkiewski understood that obeying the order would violate the agreement he had just signed. Nevertheless, he remained dependent upon the king. The second Dmitry attempted to exploit the disagreement. He offered Żółkiewski an enormous personal bribe and promised additional money, Livonia and the Seversk territories, to Sigismund if Poland recognized him as Tsar. The hetman refused. Realizing that he could neither defeat Moscow nor secure Polish support, Dmitry abandoned Kolomenskoye in August and returned to Kaluga with Marina, Zarutsky, Cossacks, Tatars, and Russian followers. Cities across central Russia began swearing allegiance to Władysław, even though the prince remained in Poland. Former Tushino officials approached Żółkiewski, begged forgiveness, and declared themselves loyal to the new Tsar. Sapieha also submitted and received amnesty. Żółkiewski wrote repeatedly to Sigismund, urging him not to destroy the settlement. The Polish commander believed that he had achieved what years of war had failed to accomplish: the end of the civil conflict and the peaceful acceptance of a Polish prince as ruler of Russia. In the meantime, Żółkiewski exercised enormous influence over the Boyar Duma. He restored many former Tushino officials to their previous positions, angering those who had remained loyal to Świeski. The old Moscow boyars did not wish to share power with men they considered traitors. Arguments spread through the court, and some restored officials again fled to Kaluga. To strengthen the settlement, a major delegation was sent from Moscow to Sigismund's camp at Smolensk. It included Metropolitan Filaret, Prince Vasily Golitsyn, Avrami Palitzin of the Trinity Sergius Monastery, and other important representatives. Their mission was to secure final approval of the treaty, end the siege of Smolensk, arrange the withdrawal of Polish troops, and bring Władysław to Moscow as an Orthodox ruler. Before their departure, Patriarch Hermogyn blessed them. Filaret promised that he would defend the Orthodox faith even at the cost of his life. The delegation left Moscow in September 1610, believing that it was going to negotiate the peaceful accession of Władysław. In reality, Sigismund had begun to imagine a far greater prize. He no longer wished merely to place his son upon the Russian throne. He wanted Russia itself. While Russia's leading churchmen and nobles traveled towards Smolensk to finalize the agreement with Prince Władysław, Hetman Stanisław Żółkiewski pursued a different objective inside Moscow. He persuaded Prince Fyodor Mstislavski, Mikhail Saltykov, and the remaining members of the Boyar Duma that the only way to restore order was to invite the Polish army into the capital. Officially, the soldiers would protect Moscow from unrest and prevent another uprising in favor of the second Dmitry. In reality, the invitation opened the gates of the city to a foreign occupation. Ignoring the warnings of Patriarch Hermogyn and other church leaders, the boyars accepted the proposal. Within days, Polish troops marched from Mozhaisk and entered Moscow during the night of September 21, 1610. When the city's inhabitants awoke the following morning, they discovered that their capital was occupied by foreign soldiers. Żółkiewski assured the population that the Polish troops had come only to safeguard the city until Władysław arrived, and that they would serve, not dominate, the Russian people. Those promises quickly proved hollow. Polish officers assumed control of the city's gates, arsenals, food supplies, streets, and fortifications. The Kremlin became military headquarters, while its palaces were transformed into residences for occupying commanders. Banquets and celebrations were held almost nightly, financed with what remained of the Russian treasury. Jan Sapieha received money and authority to establish Polish control over the Seversk region, while the deposed Tsar Vasily Świeski was removed from his confinement at the Chudov Monastery and transferred under heavy guard to another monastery farther from the capital. Alexander Gosiewski assumed command of Moscow's garrison and took control of the remaining Russian royal guards. Among Russia's senior leaders, only Patriarch Hermogyn openly condemned the occupation, but he possessed little practical power to resist it. When news reached King Sigismund, many of his advisors urged him to accept the settlement already negotiated by Żółkiewski. If Władysław honored the agreement, Poland and Russia might finally achieve peace after years of bloodshed. Sigismund rejected their advice. He no longer intended to place his son on the Russian throne. Instead, he envisioned himself ruling a vast Polish-Lithuanian-Russian monarchy under his own authority. Rather than preparing Władysław for his coronation, Sigismund ordered Russian nobles to swear loyalty directly to him. He promised offices, estates, and wealth while waiting for the Russian delegation to arrive from Moscow. The envoys grew increasingly suspicious during their journey. Reports reached them that Polish troops were violating the recently negotiated agreement by looting villages and abusing civilians throughout the countryside. The occupation that had been presented as temporary peace already resembled military conquest. When Filaret, Vasily Golitsyn, and the other delegates reached Smolensk in October 1610, they were not welcomed into either the city or the royal camp. Instead, they were forced to establish their own tents outside the Polish lines along the Dnieper River, where they endured worsening weather and diminishing supplies. Several days later, they were finally granted an audience with Sigismund. The delegation explained the agreement concluded with Żółkiewski and reminded the king that Russia had accepted Władysław as Tsar under clearly defined conditions. The Polish response stunned them. Speaking for Sigismund, Chancellor Lou Sapieha dismissed the treaty as a document negotiated by subordinates without royal authority. Władysław, he argued, was too young to govern so vast a kingdom. Sigismund himself would instead become ruler of a united Polish-Lithuanian-Russian state. The Russian delegates protested vigorously. They reminded the king that his support for successive pretenders had plunged Russia into years of civil war and devastation. They even offered enormous financial compensation if he would simply honor the original agreement and allow Władysław to ascend the throne under its terms. Sigismund refused every proposal. Territorial expansion and direct political control had become more important than compromise. News of these developments spread back to Moscow. Realizing that the agreement he had negotiated was collapsing, Żółkiewski left the capital to meet Sigismund personally. Before departing, he took with him several important prisoners, including the brothers of the former Tsar and Dmitry Świeski's wife. Vasily Świecki himself was removed from monastic confinement, dressed in plain clothing, chained like a criminal, and carried westward as the greatest trophy of Żółkiewski's victories. At Smolensk, the hetman urged Sigismund to accept the treaty and send Władysław to Moscow. The king refused. He would neither abandon the siege of Smolensk nor surrender his own ambitions for the Russian throne. Żółkiewski's departure left Moscow without effective leadership. The Boyar Duma, dominated by the elderly Prince Mstislavski, lacked both authority and military strength. Outside the capital, Prokopy Lyapunov emerged as the most energetic opponent of Polish occupation and quietly began organizing resistance. Elsewhere, the crisis deepened. Sweden strengthened its own position in the northwest, while Shah Abbas of Persia exploited Russia's weakness to pressure territories along the southern frontier. Mstislavski desperately begged Sigismund to abandon Smolensk and restore order in Moscow, but the Polish king remained obsessed with capturing the fortress. Confidence in Władysław evaporated. Residents slipped out of Moscow under cover of darkness to escape the occupation. Polish soldiers robbed civilians, abused women, desecrated churches, and plundered villages without fear of punishment. The promise of a peaceful transfer of power had dissolved into military oppression. Meanwhile, support for the second Dmitry briefly revived in parts of southern and eastern Russia. Several cities again declared loyalty to him, hoping that Kaluga might replace Moscow as the political center of the country. Yet appearances proved deceptive. Although the pretender still possessed several thousand Cossacks, Tatars, and Russian followers, his movement had already begun to lose momentum. He lived comfortably with Marina Mniszek and delayed any serious attempt to recover Moscow. During this period, Marina gave birth to a son named Ivan Dmitrievich, whom they presented as heir to the Russian throne, despite widespread doubts concerning his parentage. If Moscow remained securely in Polish hands, the pretender quietly considered abandoning central Russia altogether and retreating toward Astrakhan. He never received the opportunity. In December 1610, while hunting outside Kaluga, the second Dmitry was murdered by Prince Peter Urusov, a Nogai noble seeking revenge for the execution of a close ally. Urusov shot him and then decapitated the body before escaping with his followers. News reached Kaluga before dawn. Marina rushed into the streets demanding vengeance. Her supporters responded with indiscriminate fury, massacring every Nogai they could find and killing numerous others caught in the chaos. The pretender's headless body was buried in the local cathedral. Marina immediately attempted to secure recognition for her infant son as the next Tsar. Russian commanders rejected the proposal without hesitation. They refused to recognize a child of uncertain legitimacy ruled by his ambitious Polish mother. Instead, Kaluga's leaders declared their loyalty to the Boyar Duma in Moscow, occupied the city, and placed Marina and her son under guard. Whatever political future the second Dmitry's movement still possessed effectively died with its leader. The collapse of the pretender transformed the political landscape. Several members of the delegation at Smolensk managed to return to Moscow carrying alarming news of Sigismund's intentions. At almost the same time, the Polish king attempted one final deception by announcing that Władysław would soon travel to Russia. The announcement convinced almost no one. The boyars now understood that Sigismund intended to rule personally. They appealed to provincial towns for military assistance, warning that continued Polish occupation threatened not only Russian independence but also the future of the Orthodox faith itself. Cities across central Russia began raising volunteer armies. Ryazan, Vladimir, Suzdal, Nizhny Novgorod, Yaroslavl, Kostroma, Vologda, and many others prepared for open resistance. Sigismund responded ruthlessly. He executed Zakhar Lyapunov, imprisoned Filaret and Golitsyn as political hostages, and arranged for their removal into Poland rather than allowing them to return to Russia. By early 1611, Moscow itself exploded into open rebellion. Merchants refused cooperation with the occupiers and charged them inflated prices. The Boyar Duma divided between those still hoping for Władysław's arrival and those prepared to expel the Poles by force. Polish authorities arrested suspected conspirators while shortages of food intensified throughout the city. Outside Moscow, Prokopy Lyapunov assembled a remarkable coalition. Provincial soldiers, former rebels, Cossacks, impoverished peasants, dispossessed nobles, adventurers and volunteers all gathered beneath a common objective: the liberation of Moscow from foreign occupation. Among his allies were Prince Dmitry Trubetskoy, Ataman Ivan Zarotsky, and commanders from Vladimir, Suzdal, Kostroma, Yaroslavl, and other regions. Ironically, many had only recently fought on opposite sides during the Civil War. Inside Moscow, the Polish garrison numbered only several thousand men. They understood that they were heavily outnumbered by the city's population and by the volunteer armies advancing from every direction. With Sigismund still absorbed by the siege of Smolensk, meaningful reinforcements were unlikely. Facing encirclement, the Polish commanders chose an extreme solution. They decided to burn Moscow. Fighting erupted in March 1611 between Russian residents and occupying troops. Street battles spread rapidly from one district to another. Russians fired from rooftops, towers, and windows while driving the occupiers back toward the Kremlin. That evening, Polish cavalry deliberately set fire to large sections of the city. Houses, churches, markets, and workshops quickly ignited. As residents fled with their families through smoke-filled streets, the fires spread uncontrollably. The destruction continued for 3 days. More than 100,000 people fled the burning capital despite freezing weather and deep snow. Many died from exposure before reaching safety. Hundreds of churches and countless homes disappeared beneath the flames. When the fires finally subsided, most of Moscow lay in ruins. The occupying soldiers celebrated amid the destruction, plundering churches, monasteries, private homes, and the royal treasury. Psychological exhaustion and drunken violence became so widespread that some Polish troops even killed one another during the chaos. At roughly the same time, Prince Dmitry Pozharsky was severely wounded while leading Russian defenders into the city. His removal deprived the resistance of one of its most capable commanders during the critical opening stages of the uprising. Gosiewski used the confusion to eliminate political opponents within Moscow, while Patriarch Hermogen was again imprisoned and stripped of his authority. The occupiers briefly restored Patriarch Ignatius, who celebrated Easter while publicly praying for Władysław's reign before fleeing Moscow soon afterward. The burning of the capital transformed scattered resistance into a national movement. The Trinity Sergius Monastery sent troops and letters urging every province to raise forces for the liberation of Moscow. Refugees fleeing the city joined volunteer armies, while those unable to fight carried stories of the catastrophe across Russia. By the end of March, Lyapunov, Zarutsky, Trubetskoy, and numerous provincial commanders had reached Moscow with their combined forces. Patriarch Hermogen, threatened with death, was ordered to command the Russian army to disperse. Instead, he answered simply that the Poles should withdraw from Russia. The volunteers gradually captured most of Moscow after days of brutal fighting. Only the Kremlin and a few fortified positions remained under Polish control. Yet, victory remained incomplete. The Russian commanders frequently disagreed with one another, issued conflicting orders, and struggled to coordinate their armies. To overcome these divisions, they created a joint leadership consisting of Lyapunov, Trubetskoy, and Zarutsky. Despite internal tensions, the volunteers eventually forced the occupiers back into the Kremlin. Polish casualties mounted rapidly, food supplies disappeared, and the garrison became increasingly isolated. Sigismund remained unmoved. Rather than abandoning the siege of Smolensk, he arrested Filaret and Golitsyn and sent them deeper into Poland as prisoners. After nearly 20 months of resistance, Smolensk itself finally fell in June 1611. Disease, starvation, and continuous bombardment had reduced the city's defenders to a fraction of their original strength. A deserter revealed a vulnerable section of the wall, allowing Polish troops to storm the fortress. Governor Mikhail Shane and Archbishop Sergei were taken prisoner and carried west as symbols of Sigismund's triumph. Many contemporaries later argued that the king missed his greatest opportunity. Had he marched immediately toward Moscow with his remaining forces, he might have imposed his rule over Russia. Instead, exhausted by the campaign, he returned to Poland to celebrate his victory. The celebrations in Warsaw displayed the full extent of Poland's apparent success. Żółkiewski entered the city leading a magnificent triumphal procession. Former Tsar Vasily Świecki, his brothers, Russian nobles, church leaders, and the defenders of Smolensk were exhibited before cheering crowds as living trophies of war. Observers compared Żółkiewski's triumph to the Roman victory of Lucius Aemilius Paulus after the defeat of King Perseus of Macedon. Throughout Catholic Europe, the occupation of Moscow and the fall of Smolensk were celebrated as great victories over Orthodox Russia. The captive Świecki brothers were imprisoned near Warsaw. Vasily died in captivity in September 1612, followed only days later by his brother Dmitry. Both were buried quietly to prevent their graves from becoming places of political remembrance. Filaret, Golitsyn, Shine, and other prisoners remained in Polish captivity for years before eventually returning to a Russia that was still struggling to emerge from one of the darkest chapters in its history. While the Polish garrison remained trapped inside the Kremlin and portions of Moscow, the siege outside the city continued under the uneasy leadership of Prokopy Lyapunov, Dmitry Trubetskoy, and Ivan Zarutsky. Although united in their determination to expel the occupiers, the three commanders differed sharply in their ambitions. Zarutsky, commanding a powerful Cossack force, increasingly looked beyond the liberation of Moscow towards securing the Russian throne for himself. He cultivated support among the Cossacks while keeping close ties with Marina Mniszek and her infant son, whom many still regarded as possible claimants to the crown. Rumors spread that Zarutsky had become Marina's lover and intended to rule through her child. Recognizing the danger of military strongmen dominating the country, Lyapunov attempted to restore civil authority. He convened a national assembly representing soldiers, nobles, and government officials and established a provisional council to administer territories outside Polish control. In the spring of 1611, delegates from 25 cities endorsed a constitutional charter outlining the principles of a temporary government. Lyapunov envisioned a peaceful transition after Moscow's liberation, culminating in the election of a universally accepted Tsar. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Lyapunov showed little desire to wear the crown himself. Instead, he searched for a ruler capable of restoring stability and even opened correspondence with Swedish commander Jakub de la Gardie, hoping Swedish military assistance might eliminate both the Polish occupation and the growing threat posed by Zarutsky's increasingly undisciplined Cossacks. His efforts created new enemies. Trubetskoy and Zarutsky believed their military achievements entitled them to greater influence than the civilian administration Lyapunov was constructing. Tensions escalated further as Lyapunov repeatedly ordered the Cossacks to stop looting villages and abusing civilians. Resentment simmered until discipline finally collapsed. Attempting to escape the growing hostility, Lyapunov tried to return to Ryazan but was intercepted by Cossacks and brought back to the camp outside Moscow. Polish commander Alexander Gosiewski, recognizing Lyapunov as the most dangerous organizer of Russian resistance, secretly forged documents suggesting that Lyapunov intended to suppress the Cossacks after victory. The forged letters achieved exactly the desired effect. Furious Cossacks ignored Lyapunov's protests and hacked both him and Ivan Rjevsky to death with sabers. Their mutilated bodies remained exposed for several days before being carried to the Trinity Sergius Monastery for burial. None of those responsible were ever punished. While Russian resistance fractured, Sweden advanced steadily in the northwest. Jakub de la Gardie expanded Swedish control across Karelia before moving against Novgorod. Poor weather delayed operations for months, but in July 1611, Swedish forces stormed the city. After 8 days of fighting, Novgorod surrendered. Metropolitan Isidore and Prince Ivan Odoyevsky accepted Swedish authority and agreed that one of King Charles IX's sons might eventually become ruler of the region. Publicly, the arrangement appeared to preserve local autonomy. Privately, Charles intended nothing less than permanent Swedish expansion into Russian territory. The Swedish proposal soon reached Moscow. If the capital rejected it, de la Gardie warned, Swedish armies would continue advancing southward. Elsewhere, another familiar figure reappeared. Jan Sapieha, whose earlier campaigns had devastated central Russia, returned to Moscow claiming he wished to assist the Russian cause. His offer was rejected, prompting him to resume looting nearby settlements before later helping supply the Polish garrison trapped inside the Kremlin. His renewed career ended abruptly when illness claimed his life in September 1611. King Sigismund, meanwhile, appointed the distinguished Lithuanian commander Jan Karol Chodkiewicz to relieve Moscow. Arriving with only a few thousand exhausted troops after the long Smolensk campaign, Chodkiewicz found conditions too difficult for immediate operations and withdrew to regroup. The Polish soldiers inside Moscow, increasingly desperate, begged Sigismund for food and reinforcements. At the same time, the citizens of Nizhny Novgorod began assembling another volunteer army. The Polish authorities demanded that Patriarch Hermogen order them to abandon the effort. He refused, openly condemning the occupiers instead. Enraged, the Poles confined the elderly patriarch to his cell, where he remained under harsh conditions until his death in January 1612. Many contemporaries believed he had been deliberately starved. His death transformed him into one of the great symbols of Russian resistance. His removal also allowed the occupiers to install another patriarch more willing to cooperate with Polish authority. The arrangement won little respect among the population. As Russia struggled against foreign occupation, another pretender emerged. A wandering monk known as Isidore proclaimed himself the miraculously surviving Dmitry Ivanovich. Residents of Novgorod laughed at his extraordinary tale, but he found a handful of followers and relocated first to Ivangorod and then to Pskov. There, amid exhaustion, war, and despair, his claims gained surprising acceptance. Like the earlier false Dmitris, his personal credibility mattered less than the hope he represented. Many Russians no longer believed his story, yet still embraced him as a possible instrument for ending the country's endless turmoil. By early 1612, Cossack leaders proclaimed him Tsar, and even Trubetskoy and Zarutsky reluctantly acknowledged his authority rather than risk another confrontation with their increasingly unpredictable followers. The decision divided the anti-Polish movement. While Western regions increasingly recognized the new pretender, Eastern Russia rejected him completely. Cities such as Kazan, Vladimir, Kostroma, Nizhny Novgorod, and Yaroslavl instead rallied around Prince Dmitry Pozharsky. Yaroslavl quickly emerged as the principal center of patriotic resistance. Refugees, merchants, noble families, military commanders, and church leaders gathered there in growing numbers. Supplies poured into the city, creating a stable political and military base unlike the chaotic camps surrounding Moscow. In April 1612, Pozharsky circulated letters throughout Russia denouncing Sidorka, Marina Menishek, and the commanders supporting them. He appealed for unity against pretenders, foreign occupiers, and internal division. Dozens of influential nobles endorsed the proclamation. The campaign quickly undermined the new impostor. By May, support in Pskov had begun to evaporate. Sidorka narrowly escaped an assassination attempt before being captured by his own followers, chained, and brought back into the city. Within weeks, the illusion collapsed entirely. he was transported under heavy guard toward Moscow as a disgraced prisoner. His downfall embarrassed Zarutsky, who had publicly recognized him as the legitimate Tsar. After sending an apologetic letter to the council at Yaroslavl, he received only criticism rather than forgiveness. Humiliated and increasingly jealous of Požarsky's growing prestige, Zarutsky began plotting revenge. Meanwhile, the military situation around Moscow slowly shifted. Chodkiewicz strengthened his forces by absorbing the remnants of Sapieha's army, but repeated attempts to break the Russian siege failed. Autumn rains forced another withdrawal, leaving the Kremlin increasingly isolated. Within Moscow, food shortages grew steadily worse. Russian forces attempted another assault during the winter of 1611, but failed to penetrate the defenses. Internal disagreements further weakened the besiegers, as rival Cossack leaders quarreled and dispersed to separate camps. During the spring of 1612, a new military council selected Prince Dmitry Cherkassky as commander acceptable to most factions. At the same time, additional regiments gathered at Yaroslavl under Požarsky's direction, steadily rebuilding Russia's military strength. Conditions inside the Kremlin deteriorated rapidly. Lacking regular pay, Polish troops stripped palaces, monasteries, churches, and royal tombs of valuables. Gold, silver, jewels, icons, ceremonial robes, furniture, and countless treasures disappeared into wagons destined for Poland. Even decorations adorning the graves of former Tsars were torn away. As provisions vanished, many soldiers abandoned Moscow altogether. Those attempting to transport their stolen wealth westward frequently fell victim to brigands who robbed the robbers before they reached safety. Recognizing that final victory might finally be within reach, Požarsky inspected his artillery in preparation for a decisive campaign. During one inspection, an assassin suddenly attacked him with a knife. The blow missed its intended target and instead killed a blacksmith named Roman standing nearby. Captured and tortured, the assassin confessed that two Cossacks acting on behalf of Zarutsky had organized the attempt. The revelation destroyed what remained of Zarutsky's credibility. Realizing his position had become untenable, he abandoned the siege with approximately 2,000 disillusioned followers. By late summer, substantial reinforcements reached Moscow. Požarsky's army, together with Trubetskoy's forces, now greatly outnumbered Chodkiewicz's exhausted relief army. Fighting erupted over 2 consecutive days in August 1612. Although neither side achieved a spectacular battlefield triumph, Chodkiewicz ultimately abandoned the campaign and retreated towards Smolensk, leaving the Polish garrison trapped without hope of rescue. With the external threat removed, Russian commanders reorganized once again. A new triumvirate consisting of Trubetskoy, Požarsky, and Kuzma Minin assumed leadership of the final siege. Požarsky first attempted negotiation. He offered the remaining defenders honorable surrender and safe passage if they abandoned the Kremlin. The Polish commanders rejected the proposal, convinced that Prince Władysław would eventually arrive with reinforcements. Inside the fortress, however, reality grew increasingly desperate. Civilians were expelled to conserve food, and Russian refugees described widespread abuse, including rape and violence committed by occupying soldiers. Soon, starvation reached catastrophic levels. After consuming every available loaf of bread, defenders slaughtered dogs and cats. They stripped bark from trees, gathered weeds, and searched desperately for anything edible. With winter arriving early, even these meager resources disappeared beneath snow. Eventually, cannibalism emerged among the starving defenders as prisoners were murdered to provide food. By October, nearly half the remaining garrison had died. Negotiations resumed, but again failed. Finally, impatient Cossacks stormed part of the defenses, inflicting severe casualties and destroying what remained of Polish morale. The following day, Prince Mstislavski, representing the surviving Boyar Duma, formally renounced allegiance to Władysław and agreed to cease all cooperation with Sigismund. The remaining Polish soldiers accepted evacuation without the treasures they had stolen. On October 26, 1612, the gates of the Kremlin opened after more than 2 years of foreign occupation. Russian troops entered a city almost beyond recognition. Vast districts lay in ruins beneath snow and ash. Burned churches, collapsed buildings, and unburied corpses testified to years of civil war, invasion, famine, and occupation. Yet amid the devastation, a victory procession wound through Moscow's surviving streets before entering the Kremlin, symbolizing the restoration of Russian control over its capital. Even before Moscow was fully secured, new dangers remained. Sweden continued expanding in the northwest, while Poland prepared another campaign. Pożarski delayed Swedish ambitions through skillful diplomacy, persuading Stockholm to postpone further advances while Russia consolidated its position. King Charles IX died soon afterward, but Sweden nevertheless retained important Baltic territories, leaving Russia isolated from the sea. Sigismund likewise launched one final invasion during the summer of 1612, hoping at last to secure the Russian throne for Władysław. Progress proved painfully slow. Poor roads, supply difficulties, and the refusal of Russian towns to support the expedition steadily weakened the army. By late autumn, Sigismund reached only the outskirts of central Russia, unaware that Moscow had already been liberated. When his envoys demanded the city's surrender, the new Russian leadership imprisoned them instead. Recognizing that the campaign had failed, Sigismund finally ordered a retreat. The withdrawal through snow and freezing temperatures foreshadowed later disasters that would befall invading armies marching west from Moscow in centuries to come. With both foreign offensives halted, Russia could finally begin rebuilding its shattered state. The country remained devastated. Much of Moscow still lay in ruins. The population had collapsed, agriculture had been ruined, the treasury was empty, and government institutions scarcely functioned. Late in 1612, Pożarski summoned a national assembly to elect a new Tsar. Numerous candidates appeared, including military commanders, powerful nobles, and even Marina Mniszek's infant son, whom Zarutsky unsuccessfully promoted. After months of debate, attention gradually shifted towards 16-year-old Mikhail Romanov, the son of the imprisoned Metropolitan Filaret and a distant relative of Ivan IV through the Romanov family. Support for Mikhail steadily grew. Noble families, influential clergy, and respected monks argued that his youth made him acceptable to competing factions, while his family connections provided dynastic legitimacy. Military leaders hoping to dominate the government found themselves outmaneuvered by civilian and ecclesiastical supporters. On February 21, 1613, the assembly finally elected Mikhail Romanov as Tsar of Russia. Delegates traveled to the Ipatiev monastery near Kostroma, where the young prince and his mother had taken refuge. Initially reluctant, Mikhail eventually accepted the crown after repeated assurances that experienced nobles and church leaders would guide him during the country's recovery. He entered Moscow in May 1613. 2 months later, on July 11th, Metropolitan Ephraim of Kazan crowned him in the Kremlin. The ceremony marked more than the coronation of a new ruler. It signaled the beginning of the Romanov dynasty, which would govern Russia for more than 3 centuries. The time of troubles had ended, but its scars remained visible everywhere. Cities lay abandoned, villages had vanished, frontier regions had been overrun by enemies, and the population had suffered years of famine, invasion, civil war, and political chaos. Recovering from such devastation would require decades, yet the election of Mikhail Romanov finally provided Russia with the stable government it had lacked since the death of Tsar Fyodor Ivanovich, opening a new chapter in the country's history.